Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity slows down and history unfolds at a pace gentle enough to rest beside. Tonight, we are travelling back more than 3,000 years to the warm stone valleys of ancient Egypt, to a name that feels both distant and strangely familiar. Tutankhamun, the boy king, the young pharaoh whose golden face has become one of the most recognised images from the ancient world. His life was brief, his reign was short, and yet his presence has stretched across centuries in a way few rulers ever achieve, not because he conquered vast lands or commanded enormous armies, not because he reshaped the structure of empire or ruled for decades. In truth, he did very little that would usually secure a place in history books. And still, here we are, speaking his name softly in the quiet hours of the night. There is something steady and almost comforting about that. When most people think of ancient Egypt, the image that appears first is not a battle scene or a towering temple. It is a mask, gold, smooth, calm, eyes lined in dark stone, a face that seems composed and eternal. That face belongs to Tutankhamun. Or at least, it is how artists of his time chose to present him to eternity. Strong, youthful, serene, a ruler frozen in ideal perfection. But behind that golden surface was a child, a teenager, a young man who inherited a kingdom that was confused, divided, and still unsettled from the religious revolution of his father. He stepped onto the throne at an age when most children today are still discovering who they are, let alone being asked to carry the weight of a civilization already thousands of years old. Ancient Egypt was not a small or fragile state when Tutankhamun was born. It was a civilization with deep roots and long memory. The pyramids at Giza were already ancient monuments by his time. The Great Sphinx had been weathered by centuries of desert wind. Dynasties had risen and fallen, temples had been built and rebuilt, and the Nile continued its quiet, dependable flooding year after year. Into that long history, Tutankhamun arrived as a minor figure at first, a prince in a palace, a child among courtiers and priests, a name not yet significant. His birth name was not even Tutankhamun, it was Tutankhaten. That detail alone tells us something important. Names in ancient Egypt were not decorative, they were declarations. They tied a person to gods, to beliefs, to political directions. The ending of his original name, Aten, connected him directly to the sun disk worship promoted by his father, the pharaoh Akhenaten, a radical ruler who attempted to reshape Egypt's spiritual life by elevating one god above all others. That change did not sit comfortably with everyone. By the time Tutankhaten was old enough to understand the walls around him, Egypt had already been reshaped by religious tension. Temples dedicated to long-standing gods like Amun had been closed, priests had lost influence, new artistic styles had replaced older traditions, a new capital city had even been built in the desert, away from Thebes, to honour this focused devotion to Aten. For a child growing up inside that transformation, the world would not have felt stable. It would have felt shifting, uncertain, watched closely by advisors and elders who understood more than he did. When Akhenaten died, the throne did not pass to a seasoned general or a mature statesman. It passed to a boy. Historians still debate his exact age at accession, but most agree he was around 8 or 9 years old. Imagine the weight of that moment. A crown placed on a child's head. A double crown symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt. A ritual performance declaring him a living god on earth. Yet children do not suddenly become omniscient because gold rests on their brow. Behind the throne stood powerful figures, advisors, courtiers, men who had survived the upheaval of Akhenaten's reign and were prepared to guide or perhaps direct the young king. Among them were an experienced court official, and Horemheb, a military leader who understood the importance of restoring stability. Tutankhaten's reign began not with dramatic conquest, but with correction, a gradual turning back toward tradition. The old gods were restored, the temples reopened, the name of Amun returned to prominence, and in a symbolic gesture that echoed throughout the kingdom, the young king changed his own name from Tutankhamun, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. That change was not casual. It was political, spiritual, and deeply intentional. It signalled to Egypt that the experiment of his father was being softened, if not reversed. It told priests that their positions would be respected again. It reassured citizens that the gods of their ancestors had not been permanently replaced. Through these actions, Tutankhamun's reign became one of restoration rather than innovation. He did not build towering pyramids. He did not carve his legacy into every corner of the desert. Instead, he worked, with guidance, to steady a kingdom that had tilted off balance. Daily life inside the palace would not have felt like myth. It would have felt structured and ceremonial. Lessons in language and ritual, training in archery and chariot driving, appearances before officials, formal meals prepared by attendants, medical treatments for ailments that modern science now suggests he endured quietly, including physical weaknesses and inherited conditions. Studies of his mummy have revealed that he likely walked with difficulty. He may have relied on canes, several of which were found in his tomb. This image contrasts sharply with the athletic hunting scenes painted for royal propaganda. The golden mask shows perfection. The body beneath tells a more human story. And perhaps that is why his legacy lingers. Because he was not an invincible conqueror. He was fragile. He was young. He was navigating expectations far larger than himself. At around 19 years old, Tutankhamun died. The cause remains debated. Injury, illness, genetic complications, or a combination of factors. His death came suddenly. There was no long reign to prepare for succession, no monumental legacy carved into the stone of decades. His burial appears to have been organised quickly. The tomb prepared for him was smaller than those of other pharaohs. Some artefacts may have originally been intended for someone else, and yet within that compact space an extraordinary collection of treasures was placed. Golden shrines nested within one another, jewellery, chariots, statues, everyday items prepared for use in the afterlife. Then something unexpected happened. The tomb was forgotten. While other royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were looted and emptied over centuries, Tutankhamun's burial chamber remained largely sealed. Covered by debris and overshadowed by later constructions, it slipped from memory. Dynasties rose and fell. Empires came and went. The language of hieroglyphs was eventually lost. And still, beneath the desert floor, the young king rested. Until 1922. When British archaeologist Howard Carter uncovered the steps leading down into the tomb, he could not have known that he was about to change modern understanding of ancient Egypt. The treasures inside were unlike anything previously discovered. They offered a nearly intact glimpse into royal burial practices. They revealed craftsmanship of astonishing detail. They placed Tutankhamun's face before the modern world in gold and lapis lazuli. From that moment forward, the boy king became a global figure, not because of military triumph, not because of architectural genius, but because his tomb survived long enough to be opened in an era ready to document and display it. His story is therefore unusual. In life, he was a minor ruler overshadowed by more forceful personalities before and after him. In death, he became the symbol of an entire civilization. And as we settle into this quiet exploration, moving slowly through his world, it is worth remembering that history often preserves the unexpected. The ruler who changed everything is sometimes less visible than the one whose resting place remained undisturbed. Over the course of this gentle journey, we will step carefully through the political world he inherited, the religious tensions he navigated, the palace life he experienced, and the mysterious circumstances of his death. We will consider the advisors who shaped his reign, the marriage that bound him to royal bloodlines, the fragile body beneath the golden regalia, and the astonishing rediscovery that brought his name back into conversation after 3 millennia of silence. Ancient Egypt can feel distant, monumental, carved in stone and unreachable, yet at its centre were people, children, families, leaders who felt pressure, fear, and expectation. Tutankhamun stands as a reminder that even in civilizations built on grand temples and eternal gods, human vulnerability remained constant. The desert that once covered his tomb still stretches wide and warm under the sun. The Nile continues its steady rhythm, and somewhere between the towering statues and the quiet burial chamber lies the story of a young king who did not choose the moment he was born into, but carried it as best he could. For now we begin not with his crown, but with the world that shaped him. Before he was Tutankhamun, before his name was carved into cartouches and sealed within golden coffins, Egypt itself was undergoing change. The reign of his father had unsettled traditions that had stood for centuries. Temples had fallen silent. Priests had been dismissed. Artistic styles had shifted into unfamiliar forms. To understand the boy king, we must first understand that world. The kingdom he stepped into was not calm. It was recovering. It was watching. It was waiting for stability to return. And so, we move gently backward a few years before his birth, to a time when the sun disk Aten rose higher than all other gods. When Akhenaten stood beneath its rays and declared a new direction for Egypt, setting into motion the circumstances that would shape the life of the young pharaoh, whose golden face still gazes outward across time, steady and composed, as the story continues forward into the reign that made him both a child of upheaval and an unexpected symbol of endurance. Long before the name Tutankhamun was spoken in temple courtyards or carved into stone, Egypt was already changing beneath a different sun. The Nile still rose and fell with its dependable rhythm. Farmers still pressed seeds into dark, wet soil. Priests still moved through temple halls carrying incense and murmured prayers. From a distance, the kingdom appeared steady, ancient, secure in traditions that stretched back further than memory could comfortably measure. Yet, at the centre of power, something unusual was unfolding. The pharaoh on the throne was not content to rule as others had ruled. He was born Amenhotep IV, son of Amenhotep III, inheritor of one of the most prosperous periods Egypt had known. Gold flowed in from Nubia. Diplomatic marriages tied Egypt to foreign courts. Massive temple complexes rose in honour of Amun, the powerful god of Thebes whose priesthood had grown wealthy and influential. For generations, the relationship between pharaoh and priesthood had functioned like a careful balance. The king was divine, but the temples were essential. Rituals maintained cosmic order, offerings sustained the gods. In return, the gods sustained Egypt. Amenhotep IV stepped into this arrangement and quietly began to tilt it. At first, the shift may not have seemed dramatic. Egyptian religion had always allowed for flexibility. Gods merged, overlapped, took on aspects of one another. The sun god Ra had long been central. Amun had fused with Ra to become Amun-Ra. Divine hierarchies were fluid. Devotion was layered rather than exclusive. But Amenhotep IV's focus on one form of the sun was different. The Aten, represented as a radiant disk whose rays ended in small hands, became increasingly prominent during his reign. Early monuments show the Aten receiving attention and offerings. Temples dedicated to the Aten were constructed, not in the traditional enclosed style, but open to the sky, so sunlight could pour directly onto the altars. That architectural detail mattered. Traditional temples were shadowed spaces filled with columns and mystery. The Aten temples invited light, direct, visible, unavoidable light. As the years passed, the shift deepened. The pharaoh changed his own name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. Names in ancient Egypt were declarations of allegiance. This was not subtle, it signalled a decisive turning. Images of older gods were chiselled away from monuments. the powerful priesthood of Amun saw its influence shrink. Resources once directed toward established temples were redirected toward the Aten. In inscriptions, the Aten was elevated above other gods, sometimes described in terms that approached exclusivity. Egypt had seen religious innovation before. What made this period unsettling was its speed and its scope. Akhenaten did not merely emphasize a favourite deity, he restructured the spiritual landscape of the kingdom, and in doing so he shifted political power. Priests who had long controlled wealth and ritual authority found themselves sidelined. Courtiers adjusted carefully. Officials watched the direction of the wind. Then came a decision that startled even those accustomed to royal unpredictability. Akhenaten abandoned Thebes. Thebes had been a major religious and political centre for generations. Its temples were monumental. Its traditions were layered with centuries of continuity. To leave it behind was not simply a change of address, it was a statement. In the desert between Memphis and Thebes, Akhenaten established a new capital city. He named it Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. Today it is known as Amarna. The site was chosen with symbolic intention. Inscriptions carved into boundary stele described how the Aten had revealed this location to the king. The city was to be built fresh, untouched by older gods. Construction happened quickly. Palaces, administrative buildings, temples, workshops, homes for officials, all rising from desert ground within a short span of years. Artisans worked under new aesthetic guidelines. The artistic style of the Amarna period shifted dramatically from earlier conventions. Figures became elongated, faces were rendered with unusual realism, royal family scenes depicted intimacy rather than rigid formality. Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, were shown beneath the rays of the Aten, hands extended toward them in blessing. Their daughters appeared frequently in reliefs, playing at their parents' feet, a softness rarely emphasized in earlier royal art. For those living within the city, life would have felt different. The focus of ritual was no longer hidden statues in dark sanctuaries, but open courtyards filled with sunlight. Hymns to the Aten spoke of universal light touching all lands. There was an almost poetic emphasis on direct experience of the sun's warmth and energy. At the same time, older cults were not simply set aside. In many cases, they were actively suppressed. The name of Amun was erased from monuments. References to other deities diminished. Egypt's spiritual ecosystem narrowed. For common citizens in distant towns, daily routines likely changed little at first. Farmers still farmed, craftsmen still crafted. Yet the absence of familiar temple rituals would have been noticed. Festivals dedicated to traditional gods may have been curtailed. Local priests would have faced uncertainty. Power in ancient Egypt was never purely spiritual. Temples controlled land, labour and resources. When Akhenaten redirected devotion, he also redirected economic structures. The reasons behind his transformation remain debated. Some scholars view him as an early monotheist. Others see political calculation, an effort to break the influence of entrenched priesthoods. Still others consider personal conviction, perhaps intensified by his relationship with Nefertiti and the symbolic appeal of the visible sun. What is clear is that his reign created division. Egypt had long defined itself through continuity. Pharaohs upheld Ma'at, the principle of order and balance. Stability was sacred. The sudden elevation of one god above all others disrupted that balance in ways both visible and subtle. Into this shifting world a child was born. Tutankhamun, the future Tutankhamun, entered life under the rays of the Aten. His earliest years would have been shaped by the atmosphere of Amarna. The palace complex, decorated with bright reliefs of the royal family beneath sunlight, would have been his playground. His education would have centred on the theology his father promoted. He likely saw his father not as a revolutionary, but simply as king. For a child, upheaval is often normalised. What adults recognize as instability can feel ordinary when it is all one has known. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Foreign policy during Akhenaten's reign appears to have suffered. Letters discovered at Amarna reveal correspondence between Egyptian officials and foreign rulers, some pleading for military assistance that never arrived. Territories once firmly within Egypt's influence showed signs of strain. Whether Akhenaten was indifferent to these appeals, or simply constrained by internal focus, remains uncertain. What matters is that Egypt's position abroad weakened slightly during this period. Stability, so carefully cultivated by earlier pharaohs, was not as firm as it had been. Within the court, advisors navigated carefully. Figures such as A and Horemheb were already present, experienced men observing the king's priorities and the kingdom's reactions. They would survive beyond Akhenaten's lifetime, carrying with them memories of this radical phase. Akhenaten ruled for approximately 17 years. Over that span, the Aten remained central. Nefertiti stood prominently beside him. Their daughters appeared in reliefs. The capital city flourished briefly in desert brightness. Then, as unexpectedly as his transformation had begun, Akhenaten's reign ended. The circumstances of his death are not fully clear. What followed was confusion. A short-lived ruler, perhaps Smenkhkare, may have briefly taken the throne. Nefertiti's role during this transitional period remains debated. The historical record grows thin and fragmented. What is certain is that the religious revolution did not endure in its original form. The forces that had been suppressed did not vanish. The priesthood of Amun retained influence in memory and in structure. Officials accustomed to broader religious networks recognized the instability of a singular focus. Egypt's identity was not easily rewritten. When the young Tutankhamun was elevated to the throne, he inherited not a calm, unified kingdom, but one in need of reassurance. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The weight of that moment cannot be overstated. The crown symbolized not only authority, but divine continuity. And continuity had been shaken. The boy king's earliest years of rule unfolded under the guidance of experienced adults. Decisions were made in his name. Policies were crafted with his cartouche affixed. Among the most significant of those decisions was the gradual restoration of traditional religion. The name change from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun marked a turning point. It signaled to Egypt that the exclusive emphasis on Aten was softening. The temples of Amun reopened, rituals resumed. The old gods were welcomed back into official recognition. This was not a violent reversal. It was measured, deliberate, a careful recalibration rather than an outright condemnation. Akhetaten, the desert capital, did not remain central for long. Administrative focus shifted back toward older power centres. Thebes regained prominence. The experiment of a sun-centred city faded. For those who had lived in Amarna, the transition must have felt disorienting. A city built with divine intention now stood vulnerable. Over time, its structures would be dismantled, its stones reused in other constructions. The horizon of the Aten became an archaeological site buried beneath sand. Akhenaten himself was later treated with ambivalence. In some official king lists, his name was omitted. Monuments bearing his cartouche were altered. Memory in ancient Egypt was a powerful tool. To erase a name was to diminish legacy, and yet complete erasure is rarely achieved. The traces of his reign remained in art, in fragments of temples, in letters preserved by accident. Most significantly, they remained in the life of his son. Tutankhamun's identity cannot be separated from the world shaped by Akhenaten. His childhood unfolded in a city dedicated to sunlight. His early name bound him to a singular deity. His accession represented both continuity and correction. Understanding Egypt under Akhenaten provides the foundation for understanding the boy king who followed. Without that context, Tutankhamun appears as a minor ruler, whose fame rests on a golden mask. With that context, he becomes a bridge, a child stepping into a role defined by restoration. The sun that dominated his father's theology did not disappear overnight. It continued to rise each morning over the Nile, indifferent to political shifts. Farmers continued their work. Craftsmen continued their labour. Yet in temple halls and palace corridors, the balance of power realigned. As we move gently forward, leaving behind the intense brightness of Akhenaten's experiment, we approach the early years of a young ruler tasked with steadying what had been unsettled. The boy who would become Tutankhamun did not choose the upheaval that shaped his infancy. He inherited it. And in the quiet spaces of palace education, under the watchful eyes of advisors who had seen revolution firsthand, the child prepared, perhaps without fully understanding, to guide Egypt back toward the familiar rhythms it had known for centuries, even as the memory of a single radiant sun lingered in the background, shaping expectations and influencing every step that followed. When Tutankhamun was born, Egypt was not a quiet place of seamless tradition. It was a kingdom adjusting to a new rhythm, one that had been imposed from the top and accepted with varying degrees of enthusiasm below. The Nile still flooded, scribes still sharpened their reeds, and temple walls still bore carved hieroglyphs. Yet the spiritual air of the country had shifted. The names spoken in prayer had changed. The centres of influence had moved, and within the newly built city of Akhetaten, the royal household lived under the open light of a god represented not by statue, but by a disk of sun with outstretched rays. The prince who would one day be known as Tutankhamun entered this world as Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. His name alone reveals the atmosphere of his earliest days. He was born into a royal ideology that placed the Aten at the centre of everything. The language of devotion, the architecture of temples, the art that decorated palace walls, all revolved around that glowing symbol in the sky. His exact parentage is still discussed by historians, but genetic studies suggest that he was the son of Akhenaten and a woman closely related to him, likely one of his sisters. Royal families in ancient Egypt often practiced sibling marriage to preserve divine bloodlines. To modern sensibilities, that choice may feel unsettling. To the Egyptians, it reinforced the idea that the pharaoh was not merely human. He was divine, descended from gods, maintaining sacred continuity through controlled lineage. From his first breath, Tutankhaten belonged not to himself, but to a dynasty that expected him to embody divinity. His childhood would have unfolded within the palaces of Amarna, the capital carved into the desert cliffs along the eastern bank of the Nile. The city was new, built rapidly under Akhenaten's instruction. Unlike older cities layered with centuries of tradition, Amarna felt deliberate, planned, almost experimental. Its broad streets ran between whitewashed buildings. Its temples were open courtyards designed to capture sunlight. The royal residence overlooked the river, and reliefs on its walls showed scenes of domestic intimacy rarely emphasized in earlier Egyptian art. In these reliefs, Akhenaten and Nefertiti appear seated with their daughters, holding them on their laps, touching their faces affectionately. The rays of the Aten stretched down toward the family, ending in small hands offering ankhs, the symbol of life. It is within this artistic environment that the young prince was raised. He would have grown accustomed to seeing his parents depicted not as distant, rigid figures, but as participants in familial scenes. Whether those images reflect daily reality or simply artistic messaging remains uncertain. Royal life was structured. Education began early. Even as a small child, Tutankhaten would have been surrounded by attendants, nurses, tutors and guards. His movements would not have been entirely his own. His lessons likely included reading and writing hieroglyphs, understanding religious hymns dedicated to the Aten, training in etiquette, and instruction in the expectations placed upon a future king. Physical training would have been encouraged as well. Archery, chariot driving and hunting were considered essential royal skills, even if the prince's physical condition made some of these activities challenging. Modern examinations of his remains suggest he may have suffered from congenital conditions affecting his bones and mobility. Several walking canes were found in his tomb, many showing signs of use. If he experienced discomfort or weakness as a child, it would have been managed discreetly within palace walls. Royal image required strength. Vulnerability was not displayed publicly. Beyond the palace gates, the country continued its uneasy adjustment to Akhenaten's reforms. The traditional priesthood of Amun had been sidelined. The powerful temple complexes in Thebes no longer received the same flow of offerings and administrative attention. Officials who had built their careers within the established religious network had to adapt quickly. For the young prince, this tension would not have been explained in political terms. Yet he would have sensed the careful tone of conversations among adults, courtiers navigating uncertain ground, advisors measuring their words, servants responding to shifts in hierarchy. He was not simply growing up in a new city. He was growing up in a moment of ideological transformation. Akhenaten's focus on the Aten was not casual devotion. It reshaped the visual language of Egypt. Traditional depictions of gods in animal-headed forms gave way to the singular sun disk. Artistic conventions changed proportions and posture. Faces were elongated. Bodies appeared softer, more fluid. The royal family was portrayed with distinctive features, sometimes exaggerated in ways that still puzzle scholars. Tutankhamun's earlier sense of identity would have been shaped by that visual environment. The only god he would have formerly known in childhood was the Aten, the language of prayer directed upward toward visible sunlight. The festival celebrated in Amarna revolved around daily offerings presented in open courts, where the king and queen acted as intermediaries between the god and the people. There is a quiet irony in this arrangement. While Akhenaten elevated the Aten above all other deities, ordinary citizens could not approach the god directly. The king positioned himself and his family as the sole channel through which divine favour flowed. In a sense, religious power became even more centralised. As Tutankhamun grew, he would have been aware that his role was not optional. He was a symbol as much as a child. Every public appearance carried meaning. Every ritual participation reinforced the narrative that the royal family stood uniquely beneath the sun's blessing. The palace itself likely offered moments of ordinary childhood experience. Games played with siblings, conversations with nurses, lessons interrupted by curiosity or fatigue. Yet even these private moments unfolded within an atmosphere charged with expectation. His mother, whether Nefertiti or another royal consort, would have been a central presence in his early life. Nefertiti in particular appears prominently in Amarna art, depicted alongside Akhenaten in acts of worship and governance. If she played a maternal role for Tutankhamun, she did so as a woman already deeply integrated into the religious transformation of the kingdom. The prince also had half-sisters, daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Their presence in palace relief suggests a household filled with children. The sound of youthful voices likely echoed through corridors painted with scenes of devotion. Yet mortality was a constant companion in ancient Egypt. Several of these princesses died young. Illness and fragility were woven into daily life. For a child raised within this environment, the boundaries between personal affection and divine representation blurred. Family was inseparable from theology. The sun above was both physical warmth and political symbol. Meanwhile, beyond the city, foreign powers tested Egypt's attention. Letters from vassal states requesting military support hint at strain. The empire built by earlier pharaohs required careful management. Akhenaten's inward focus on religious reform may have limited his engagement with external threats. Tutankhamun would not have attended diplomatic councils as a small boy, but he would have grown up in a court aware of shifting alliances. Advisors like Ai and Horemheb, experienced in administration and military affairs, remained near the centre of power. Their patience during Akhenaten's reign suggests political calculation. They were watching, waiting. As the prince approached the age of awareness, the stability of Amarna began to waver. Akhenaten's later years appear less documented. Artistic output continued, but signs of uncertainty increase. The death of certain royal family members may have affected court dynamics. The city, once vibrant with construction, may have felt less secure. Then came the moment that would redefine the young prince's life. Akhenaten died. The circumstances remain unclear. Whether illness, natural causes, or internal struggle ended his reign, the result was the same. The architect of Egypt's religious revolution was gone, and in his absence the kingdom faced a decision. A brief transitional figure, possibly Smenkhkare, may have occupied the throne for a short period. The details are fragmentary. What is certain is that within a short span of time Tutankhamun was elevated to kingship. He was still a child. Imagine the ritual. Priests chanting, officials assembled, the double crown placed upon a head not yet fully grown, the titles recited: King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Son of Ra, divine epithets layered upon a boy who had only recently been receiving instruction from tutors. The throne room in Amarna may have felt both familiar and foreign. The palace he had known as home now became the seat of absolute authority. The adults who once guided him now bowed. Yet a child does not suddenly gain experience with a coronation. The reality is quieter and more complex. Governance would be handled largely by senior officials. Decisions made in council would carry the young king's name. He would learn through observation, through repetition, through participation in carefully managed appearances. It is at this point that the tension of his birth environment becomes most significant. Tutankhamun was crowned within a theological framework that had disrupted centuries of tradition. The Aten stood officially supreme. The capital remained in the desert. The temples of Amun were still diminished. But those conditions were not stable. The advisors surrounding the boy king understood that Egypt's strength depended on continuity. A kingdom too sharply divided could fracture. The priesthood of Amun still commanded loyalty. The old gods had not vanished from popular devotion. Gradually change began again. The young king's name shifted. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. A single alteration, but one with profound implications. It signalled a return to broader tradition. The Aten did not disappear entirely, but exclusivity softened. Temples once closed reopened, offerings resumed, the spiritual landscape widened. For the boy king, this transformation required flexibility. The god he had been taught to honour above all others was now repositioned among many. The capital city built to glorify the Aten would eventually be abandoned. The world of his childhood would not endure. There is something deeply human in that reality. The environment that shapes us is not always the one we rule. Tutankhamun was born into revolution. He ascended into restoration. His early years as prince had prepared him for divine representation, but not for theological reversal. Yet children are adaptable. What adults experience as upheaval can become routine to the young. In this way, Tutankhamun's story begins not with golden masks or sealed tombs, but with uncertainty. A boy learning who he is while the world around him shifts direction. A child of sunlight raised in a city that would not last. A prince whose earliest identity was defined by a single radiant disk, only to find himself guiding Egypt back toward the familiar chorus of many gods. The desert cliffs of Amarna still hold traces of that moment. Foundations of palaces, fragments of reliefs, names partially erased. They speak quietly of a time when Egypt experimented with singular devotion, and when a child named Tutankhamun took his first steps under a bright, unfiltered sun. And as the crown settled more firmly upon his brow, the responsibilities placed upon him grew heavier, drawing him away from the sheltered courtyards of his youth and into the measured rituals of kingship, where advisors waited patiently to shape the direction of a reign that would attempt to steady what had been unsettled and return Egypt to rhythms older than the boy himself. When the crown was placed upon the head of Tutankhamun, Egypt was not unified in spirit, even if it remained intact in territory. The rituals of kingship were performed with confidence. Priests recited ancient formulas. Officials bowed in practice sequence. Titles were spoken aloud, affirming continuity with pharaohs who had ruled long before the boy's birth. Yet beneath the ceremonial surface lay a kingdom adjusting itself after years of sharp religious redirection. He was still very young, likely no older than 9. At that age, most children are still learning discipline, language, and the rules of their household. Tutankhamun, now king, inherited not simply a palace, but an entire state whose foundations had been disturbed. The transformation initiated by Akhenaten had not ended with his death. It lingered in stone, in policy, and in memory. The city of Akhenaten still stood as the royal capital. Its temples to the Aten remained active. Its courtyards continued to receive offerings under open sunlight. The royal residence still housed the king and his attendants. On the surface, the machinery of the Athene-centered state continued to function. But Egypt's older centers of power had not forgotten their place. Thebes, long associated with Amun, retained its symbolic authority. Its priests, though reduced in influence during Akhenaten's reign, remained organized. Temple estates that once controlled vast resources had been curtailed, yet their networks persisted. Even beyond Thebes, local shrines and long-standing cults maintained quiet devotion among the population. A kingdom is not easily stripped of its spiritual memory. Ritual habits endure. Beliefs rooted in generations do not vanish within a decade. As Tutankhamun assumed his formal role, he did so within a delicate balance. He was publicly the living image of the Aten, bound by name and upbringing to his father's theology. Yet the advisors guiding him understood that exclusivity had created tension. Stability required recalibration. 2 men in particular stood near the centre of this recalibration. An experienced court official of advanced age, had served under Akhenaten and possibly earlier kings. Horemheb, a military commander with practical understanding of administration and external threats, represented continuity with Egypt's broader imperial interests. Neither was a child. Both possessed knowledge shaped by decades of service. For them, the boy king was both sovereign and opportunity. Their loyalty may have been genuine. They may also have recognized that a young ruler required direction. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs were considered divine, but childhood did not erase the need for experienced hands guiding state affairs. The decisions made during these early years of Tutankhamun's reign would bear the mark of counsel. The kingdom he inherited was divided in several ways. Religiously, the Aten remained elevated, yet dissatisfaction simmered among those who favoured restoration of the old gods. Economically, temple estates disrupted by reform required reorganisation. Politically, foreign territories once secured through diplomacy and military presence showed signs of strain. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondences preserved in clay tablets, reveal that during Akhenaten's later years, Egyptian vassals in regions like Canaan had appealed repeatedly for assistance. Some reported encroachment by rival powers. Whether those requests were ignored or simply delayed, the perception of weakened oversight could not be ignored indefinitely. Tutankhamun did not immediately lead armies or negotiate treaties. His early reign unfolded through ceremony and symbolic gestures, yet behind those gestures policy shifted. One of the earliest and most consequential changes was religious. Within a few years of his accession, the king's name was altered. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. The replacement of Aten with Amun was not cosmetic. It declared alignment with the god whose priesthood had once anchored Thebes. Inscriptions from this period emphasize restoration. Temples of traditional deities were reopened. Statues that had been neglected or removed were reinstated. Offerings resumed in sanctuaries long central to Egyptian spiritual life. Official texts describe the gods as having turned away from Egypt due to neglect, only to be welcomed back through the piety of the young king. Whether these inscriptions reflect genuine theological conviction or political necessity is secondary to their effect. They reassured the populace. They signalled that balance was returning. For the child king, this transition meant inhabiting a new identity. The theology of his upbringing was moderated. the exclusivity of Aten worship softened into reintegration with broader tradition. The capital itself began to lose primacy. Administrative focus gradually shifted back toward Memphis and Thebes. Leaving Amarna behind would not have been instantaneous. The city had been built rapidly, but it was not abandoned overnight. Court officials likely travelled between locations. Over time, however, the grand experiment of a singular sun-focused capital faded. Buildings were dismantled, materials were reused in other constructions. The horizon of the Aten receded into the desert. Inheriting a divided kingdom meant more than adjusting temple rituals. It meant navigating public perception. The people of Egypt expected Pharaoh to embody Ma'at, the principle of order and harmony. When that harmony faltered, even symbolically, reassurance was required. Royal proclamations emphasized that the young king had repaired what was broken. He was described as having restored the temples that had fallen into ruin, even if in reality the disruption had lasted little more than a decade. Language in these inscriptions framed the prior period as a kind of lapse, now corrected. Such framing served multiple purposes. It distanced the current reign from the radical exclusivity of Akhenaten. It also reinforced the authority of Tutankhamun as legitimate heir, not rebel. Within the palace, life likely remained structured and ceremonial. Tutors continued to guide his education. Ritual appearances required practice. Public festivals reintroduced under his reign demanded participation. The young king would have learned to perform his role with increasing confidence. His marriage to Ankhesenparten, later renamed Ankhesenamun, further anchored continuity. She was likely one of Akhenaten's daughters, possibly his half-sister. Their union preserved royal lineage. It also mirrored the broader pattern of religious restoration. Her name, too, shifted from association with Aten to alignment with Amun. Even in personal relationships, the kingdom's recalibration was visible. Physical evidence suggests that Tutankhamun's health remained fragile. Bone abnormalities, possible malaria infection, and congenital conditions may have limited his physical strength. Yet royal iconography presented him as active and capable. Hunting scenes depicted him in chariots, bow-drawn, triumphant over animals. These images communicated vitality, regardless of underlying reality. Inheriting division required projecting stability. The priesthood of Amun regained influence during these years. Temple construction resumed. Offerings increased. The economic networks tied to traditional worship strengthened once more. Officials who had perhaps concealed dissatisfaction during Akhenaten's reign now operated more openly. Foreign policy too required attention. Horemheb's presence suggests military readiness was not ignored. Although Tutankhamun's reign was brief, evidence indicates some engagement in maintaining Egypt's external interests. Whether he personally commanded campaigns remains doubtful given his youth and health, but the machinery of defence resumed function. The psychological weight of kingship on a child is difficult to reconstruct. Ancient sources do not record his private thoughts. They record titles, achievements, and formal declarations. Yet it is reasonable to imagine that the boy felt the expectations surrounding him. Rituals repeated daily reinforced his divine role. Advisors likely corrected him gently but firmly when protocol demanded precision. He was both central and guided, divine and dependent. The divided kingdom he inherited did not fracture into open conflict. Egypt remained structurally strong. The Nile continued its agricultural generosity. Administrative systems remained intact. The division was ideological, not territorial. Yet ideology shapes loyalty. Loyalty shapes stability. By restoring traditional worship, Tutankhamun's reign reduced tension. The old gods resumed their familiar places in temple and festival. The memory of Aten's exclusivity gradually softened. Future generations would even attempt to erase Akhenaten's radical phase from official records, blending it into the broader narrative of continuity. Tutankhamun became the pivot point of that transition. Not because he designed it alone, but because his name carried it. The palace environment reflected this shift. Art styles gradually returned to earlier conventions. The exaggerated forms of Amarna gave way to more traditional proportions. Reliefs once again emphasized formal posture and timeless serenity. Even the young king's burial equipment, prepared later in his life, would reflect restored tradition. The gods surrounding his sarcophagus were not limited to Aten. Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and others stood guard. The theological breadth of Egypt returned. As the years passed, the division he inherited narrowed. The radical edge of Akhenaten's reform dulled into historical memory. The young king's role evolved from symbol of a singular son to restorer of balance, yet he remained young. His reign lasted roughly a decade. 10 years to steady a kingdom that had tilted, 10 years to mature under scrutiny, 10 years to inhabit a role larger than childhood could comfortably hold. In that time he transformed from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, from prince of Amarna to pharaoh aligned with Thebes, from child beneath the rays of Aten to king framed by the pantheon of Egypt's ancient gods. The division he inherited did not disappear entirely. Tensions lingered in memory. Later rulers would ensure that Akhenaten's name was omitted from king lists. Monuments were altered. Official narratives streamlined the past into something more orderly. But in those early years of Tutankhamun's reign, the task was simpler and more immediate. Restore temples, reassure priests, reinforce foreign stability, present strength, maintain Ma'at. For a child, these responsibilities were immense. For a kingdom accustomed to continuity, they were necessary. And as his identity settled into its new form, as Amun's name replaced Aten's in inscriptions and prayers, the young king stood at the centre of a quiet correction, guiding Egypt back toward rhythms older than his own memory, even as the echoes of his father's bright experiment remained faintly visible in stone fragments and fading sunlight along the cliffs of the abandoned capital. In ancient Egypt, a name was never just a label. It was a statement of allegiance, a reflection of divine connection, a declaration of identity carved into stone and spoken in ritual. To change a name was not a small adjustment. It was a signal to the entire kingdom that something fundamental had shifted. When the young king first ascended the throne, he bore the name Tutankhaten, living image of the Atien. That name tied him directly to the religious vision of his father. It affirmed that he was not only a political successor, but a continuation of the Aten-centered world that had defined his earliest years. Every time his name was written inside a royal cartouche, the Aten was honoured. Every inscription reinforced that connection. Yet Egypt was not entirely comfortable beneath a single sun. As the boy king's reign progressed under the guidance of experienced advisors, it became increasingly clear that the path forward required balance. The exclusive elevation of the Aten had unsettled too many long-standing structures. Temples had lost influence. Priests had been displaced. Local communities had seen familiar rituals fade. A kingdom built on continuity cannot endure prolonged disruption without consequence. The solution would not come through dramatic speeches or open condemnation of the previous reign. It would come through something quieter and more powerful, a change in name. At some point during the early years of his rule, the king became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. The transformation was subtle in form but immense in implication. One divine element replaced another. Aten gave way to Amun, the god whose priesthood had once anchored Thebes and whose influence had stretched across centuries of Egyptian history. This was not merely religious, it was political. Amun was not an obscure deity. He had been elevated to supreme status long before Akhenaten's reforms. His temple complex at Karnak had grown into one of the most powerful religious institutions in the ancient world. Wealth flowed through its gates. Priests administered vast estates. Festivals dedicated to Amun reinforced the bond between pharaoh and divine order. When Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, he aligned himself with that powerful legacy. He signalled restoration. He reassured the priesthood. He declared, through inscription rather than proclamation, that Egypt's spiritual equilibrium was being re-established. The change would have required careful orchestration. Royal names were embedded in monuments, in temple walls, in administrative records. Artisans and scribes had to adjust their carvings. New cartouches were inscribed. Statues may have been altered. Official decrees reflected the updated identity. The kingdom was informed not through debate, but through visible alteration. To the population, the message was clear. The boy king had turned toward the old gods. This shift was not necessarily a rejection of the Aten in total. Aten did not vanish from Egypt's spiritual vocabulary overnight. What changed was exclusivity. Under Tutankhamun, the Aten became one divine presence among many, rather than the singular focus of worship. In practical terms, temples dedicated to Amun reopened. Offerings resumed. Priests returned to positions of influence. The economic networks tied to traditional religious practice regained strength. The reopening of these temples was described in inscriptions as an act of piety by the young king, framed as correction of neglect. One such inscription, often referred to as the Restoration Stela, speaks of temples that had fallen into ruin and gods who had turned away from Egypt due to lack of proper reverence. It presents Tutankhamun as the restorer of divine favour, the one who repaired sanctuaries and reinstated sacred order. The language is deliberate. It does not dwell on blame. It emphasises renewal. For a child raised in the theology of Aten, this transition required adaptation. His early education would have centred on hymns to the sun disk. Now, rituals invoking Amun, Mut, Khonsu, Osiris and others filled the ceremonial calendar. The pantheon broadened again. Priests once sidelined returned to prominence within palace corridors. There is a certain quiet resilience in that process. Egypt did not erupt into civil war over theology, it recalibrated. The name change of its king became the pivot point around which that recalibration turned. Ankhesenpaten, the king's wife, underwent a similar transformation. Her name shifted to Ankhesenamun, aligning her identity with Amun as well. Even within the royal family, the shift was visible. It was not enough for the king alone to change. The queen too embodied the restoration. Such adjustments reveal how deeply intertwined religion and governance were in ancient Egypt. A name contained policy. A cartouche contained ideology. The abandonment of Amarna as primary capital likely accelerated after the name change. While the city remained inhabited for a time, administrative focus shifted back toward Memphis and Thebes. The symbolic centre of Egypt returned to places layered with centuries of tradition. The horizon of Aten faded as the temples of Amun regained centrality. The change from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun also marked a psychological boundary between childhood and kingship. Under his birth name, he was the son of Akhenaten, raised in a singular theological framework. Under his new name, he stood as restorer of balance. The transition signalled growth, even if he remained physically young. Historians debate how much of this decision originated from the boy himself and how much from his advisors. It is unlikely that a child orchestrated such sweeping realignment alone. Ay and Horemheb, among others, likely played decisive roles in shaping policy. Yet the king's name carried divine authority. His cartouche made the shift legitimate. The power of symbolism in ancient Egypt cannot be overstated. A temple reopened by decree carried weight. A name altered on stone reshaped memory. Interestingly, the process of reversing Akhenaten's reforms did not involve immediate destruction of all traces of Aten worship. That erasure would intensify later, under subsequent rulers who sought to fully restore orthodoxy. During Tutankhamun's reign, the approach appears measured, restoration rather than vengeance. The young king's image in art also began to return to more traditional proportions. The elongated features characteristic of Amarna art softened. reliefs depicted him in more conventional postures, standing before a range of deities rather than exclusively beneath the sun disk. Through these visual cues, Egypt recognized that the pendulum had swung back toward familiarity. Changing his name altered how he would be remembered. Had his tomb been discovered bearing the name Tutankhamun, modern understanding of his role might feel different. The golden mask that now resides in museums bears the name Tutankhamun. It reflects restoration, not revolution. Names shape legacy. The boy king did not rule long enough to redefine Egypt's borders or construct monumental architecture rivaling earlier pharaohs. His significance lies partly in this act of alignment. He became the hinge between radical reform and restored continuity. For the priests of Amun, his new name was reassurance. For officials seeking stability, it was relief. For the populace, it signalled a return to rituals that structured daily life. It is easy to imagine the moment when the first official inscription bearing Tutankhamun was unveiled. The carved hieroglyphs crisp, the cartouche enclosing the name in protective oval, the divine image restored. From that point forward, the boy king's identity solidified around balance rather than exclusivity. Yet traces of his earlier identity lingered. Some objects from his tomb originally bore inscriptions associated with A10, later altered. Certain items may have been repurposed. The transitional nature of his reign left subtle marks in material culture. That duality reflects the reality of his position. He was born into one theological vision and crowned within another. His name changed, but his origins remained tied to the bright experiment of Amarna. The desert city where he spent his childhood did not vanish immediately. For a time, it remained standing, its open temples still facing the sun. But its prominence diminished as the capital's heart shifted back toward older, sacred spaces. In the broader arc of Egyptian history, the change from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun marked the beginning of the end of the Amarna period. After his reign, efforts to erase Akhenaten's legacy intensified. Later king lists omitted the radical ruler entirely, smoothing the narrative of continuity. The young king's role in that smoothing process was foundational. His name became the first stone laid in rebuilding orthodoxy. As he matured, even slightly beneath his new identity, the responsibilities of restoration continued. Temple construction projects resumed. Donations to priesthoods increased. Festivals, once interrupted, returned to the calendar. The divided kingdom he inherited began to settle into familiar patterns. A name change does not repair stone or feed fields, but it sets direction. It frames intention. It tells a story about who stands at the center of power. From Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, the story shifted from singular radiance to shared divinity, from experimental exclusivity to layered tradition, from the horizon of a new sun to the embrace of ancient gods whose temples had watched centuries pass. And as the boy king's identity aligned more firmly with Amun, the structures of Egypt's past reasserted themselves, steadying the kingdom beneath his rule and guiding the court gradually away from the stark brightness of his father's vision and toward the familiar shadows and incense-filled halls where priests once again lifted offerings to a pantheon restored, setting the stage for the next phase of his reign under advisors who understood that names could change the course of history as surely as armies. When the name of the young king shifted, the shift did not remain confined to carved stone. It moved outward, into temple courtyards, into priestly chambers, into the daily rhythm of offerings that had structured Egyptian life for centuries. The restoration of the old gods was not a single event, but a gradual unfolding, a careful reweaving of threads that had been loosened during the years of singular devotion to the Aten. Egypt had always been a land of many gods. Amun of Thebes, Ra of Heliopolis, Ptah of Memphis, Osiris of the underworld, Isis the devoted mother, Horus the falcon-headed sky god, and countless local deities whose influence shaped specific towns and regions. Each had temples, each had rituals, Each had priesthoods that maintained sacred order through daily offerings and festival celebrations. Under Akhenaten, this vast network had been narrowed. Temples were closed or stripped of prominence. Resources were redirected. The Aten stood alone at the top of official worship. For some, this may have felt spiritually invigorating. For others, it felt like the silencing of familiar voices. With Tutankhamun's accession and his adoption of Amun in his name, the old gods began to return to public prominence. One of the most significant documents from his reign is often called the Restoration Stela. In it, the king describes how temples had fallen into disrepair, how the gods had turned their faces away, and how chaos had begun to creep into the land. He presents himself as the one who repaired shrines, reinstated priests, and re-established offerings. The tone is not accusatory toward his predecessor. It is corrective. The emphasis is on renewal. Such inscriptions served multiple purposes. They reassured the priesthood that their roles were secure. They informed the populace that divine favour was being restored. They framed the young king as a restorer of Magat, the cosmic balance essential to Egypt's survival. Temple restoration required more than words. It demanded labour, materials, and administrative coordination. Stone blocks had to be carved or repurposed. Statues that had been removed or damaged needed replacement. Ritual implements were repaired or recreated. The reopening of a temple was both symbolic and practical. Priests resumed daily rituals, lighting incense, presenting food offerings, reciting hymns at dawn and dusk. In Thebes, the great temple complex of Amun at Karnak regained its centrality. Its towering pylons and massive columns once again witnessed processions of priests carrying sacred barks through festival routes. Offerings that had once flowed elsewhere returned to its storerooms. This restoration also reactivated economic networks. Temples in ancient Egypt were not merely places of worship, they were economic hubs, controlling land, employing workers, and distributing resources. When Tutankhamun reopened temples, he revived systems that supported thousands of individuals. The restoration extended beyond Amun alone. Osiris, associated with death and resurrection, regained prominence in funerary practice. Isis and Nephthys resumed their protective roles. Ptah's craftsmen in Memphis saw renewed reverence. The pantheon expanded once more into its familiar diversity. For ordinary citizens, the reopening of temples meant the return of festivals that structured the calendar. Processions honouring deities brought music, food distribution, and communal celebration. Such events reinforced identity and belonging. Their absence during the height of Aten exclusivity would have been felt. Tutankhamun's reign thus became associated with relief. The gods were back in their sanctuaries. The rituals were once again predictable. The spiritual landscape felt layered rather than singular. Within the palace, this restoration altered daily life. The king participated in ceremonies honouring multiple deities. Reliefs from his reign depict him offering to Amun, Mut and Khonsu, forming the Theban triad. These scenes differ markedly from the earlier Amarna art dominated by Aten's rays. The visual language of power returned to tradition. Proportions stabilised. Divine figures stood in recognisable forms. The king appeared as intermediary between many gods and the people, rather than sole conduit of a single solar force. The shift required diplomatic care. There is little evidence of open hostility toward Aten worshippers during Tutankhamun's reign. Instead, Aten receded naturally into secondary status. It remained acknowledged but no longer exclusive. This gradual reintegration avoided provoking conflict among those who had supported Akhenaten's reforms. Ay and Horemheb likely played key roles in orchestrating this balance. Their experience under previous reigns equipped them to manage delicate transitions. They understood that stability depended on honouring tradition without inciting rebellion among those loyal to recent changes. Restoration also meant repairing physical damage done to monuments bearing names of traditional gods. During Akhenaten's reforms, the name of Amun had been chiselled away from inscriptions in some temples. Under Tutankhamun, Artisans carefully recarve those erased hieroglyphs. In some cases, stone blocks from dismantled Athene structures were reused in rebuilding traditional temples, blending the material traces of both periods. The symbolism is striking. Stones that once formed open courtyards to the Athene were incorporated into walls honouring Amun. The revolution became part of the restoration, embedded physically within it. For the young king, participating in these ceremonies reinforced his role as divine mediator. He may not have fully understood the political calculations behind each act, but he learned the choreography of worship. He learned to present offerings before statues. He learned to recite formulaic phrases affirming continuity. As his reign progressed, inscriptions emphasized his devotion and piety. The narrative cast him as chosen by the gods to correct imbalance. The framing protected the legitimacy of his rule, while gently distancing it from the radical edge of his father's reign. The capital's gradual shift away from Amarna further symbolized restoration. Memphis and Thebes regained administrative prominence. The desert city lost its central role. Over time, its buildings fell into neglect. Officials relocated. The horizon of Athene faded from daily governance. The restoration of the old gods did not erase memory of Akhenaten's experiment. Rather, it repositioned it as an anomaly within a broader continuum. Later rulers would intensify efforts to remove his name from official lists, smoothing history into a more seamless narrative. Tutankhamun's role in that smoothing process was foundational, but not vindictive. His reign emphasized repair rather than punishment. Temples were reopened, priests reinstated, ritual calendars revived. The return of traditional worship also strengthened social cohesion. In a land stretching from Nubia to the Delta, shared religious practice bound communities together. Festivals marking the Opet celebration or other major events allowed citizens to participate in collective identity. Such participation reinforced loyalty to the crown. The young king's health may have limited his physical involvement in strenuous rituals, yet iconography presents him as fully capable. The visual narrative required vitality. Scenes of him standing before deities, holding scepters, and presenting offerings communicated stability regardless of underlying frailty. In restoring the old gods, Tutankhamun's reign recalibrated Egypt's spiritual centre. The divine order, temporarily narrowed, broadened again. The people could once more pray to familiar figures whose myths shaped understanding of life and death. Funerary practices in particular regained traditional complexity. Osiris, central to beliefs about the afterlife, resumed prominence. The idea that the pharaoh would become one with Osiris after death reinforced continuity. The theological framework for Tutankhamun's eventual burial would reflect this restored pantheon. Economically, temple estates regained land and workforce. Craftsmen resumed carving statues of diverse deities. Scribes once again copied hymns honouring a range of gods. The educational curriculum for young elites returned to traditional themes rather than singular solar devotion. All of this unfolded within roughly a decade. For a kingdom thousands of years old, that period was brief, yet the impact was lasting. The restoration stabilized Egypt. It reassured foreign allies that internal unity had returned. It strengthened domestic confidence. It re-established the narrative that Pharaoh upheld Ma'at through devotion to the full pantheon. Tutankhamun did not initiate sweeping architectural projects rivaling earlier pharaohs, but he sponsored enough temple work to demonstrate commitment. Reliefs from Karnak show him smiting enemies in traditional pose, aligning with established royal iconography. The old gods had been invited back into their houses. Their statues once again received daily offerings. Their names were spoken aloud by priests whose voices echoed through columned halls. In this way, the boy king became synonymous with restoration. His youth made the act appear almost miraculous in official narrative. A child crowned, a kingdom steadied, temples revived. The quiet reweaving of religious tradition under his reign laid the groundwork for what followed. After his death, successors would continue the process of erasing Akhenaten's singular experiment. Yet the initial turning point had already occurred when Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. The restoration of the old gods did not simply repair buildings, it repaired confidence. It reaffirmed that Egypt's spiritual foundation remained layered and resilient. And as incense once again rose in multiple sanctuaries across the land, the young king stood at the centre of a pantheon restored, his identity fully aligned with traditions older than memory, even as his own life moved steadily forward within a kingdom that had found its familiar rhythm again. A crown may rest on one head, but a kingdom rarely rests on one mind alone. When Tutankhamun ascended the throne, still a child, the visible symbol of authority was clear. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail, the royal cartouche enclosing his name. Yet behind that carefully composed image stood men who understood the machinery of power in ways the boy king could not yet fully grasp. Two figures in particular moved steadily within the shadows of the throne room, Ai and Horemheb. They were not rivals in the beginning, they were survivors. Ai was already an elderly statesman by the time Tutankhamun became king. He had likely served under Amenhotep III and certainly under Akhenaten. His career spanned periods of prosperity and upheaval. He had witnessed the shift toward Aten worship from within the court itself. His familiarity with palace politics ran deep. Horemheb, by contrast, was a military commander. His authority rested not on priestly ritual but on discipline, strategy, and the loyalty of soldiers. Where A represented continuity within the court, Horemheb represented strength beyond it. He understood the importance of maintaining Egypt's influence abroad and stability within its borders. Together, these two men formed a balance of experience that the young king needed. When Tutankhamun was crowned, he did not suddenly acquire administrative expertise. The rituals of kingship could be memorized. The gestures of offering could be practiced, but the complexities of taxation, foreign diplomacy, temple reconstruction, and military oversight required seasoned hands. Ai likely held the title of vizier or a similarly powerful administrative position during the boy's early reign. He would have overseen the daily functioning of government, ensuring decrees were drafted, projects funded, and officials supervised. His presence near the throne signalled stability to other courtiers. Horemheb, as general, maintained Egypt's military apparatus. During Akhenaten's reign, foreign territories had shown signs of unrest. Correspondence from vassal states revealed pleas for assistance. Whether those pleas had been ignored or delayed, the perception of weakened response could not be allowed to continue. Under Tutankhamun, Horemheb's role became essential. Even if the young king did not personally lead campaigns, the image of royal strength had to be reinforced. Reliefs depicting Tutankhamun in traditional smiting pose reflect this necessity. The pharaoh, regardless of age, embodied martial authority. Ai and Horemheb did not merely serve the king, they shaped his reign. The decision to restore traditional worship likely emerged through council. The reopening of temples required coordination across administrative networks. Ai, familiar with priesthood hierarchies, would have understood how to reintegrate displaced officials without igniting resentment. Horemheb, aware of foreign policy concerns, would have supported measures that reassured allies and deterred adversaries. A divided spiritual landscape could project weakness. Restoration projected unity. Their motivations were not necessarily identical. Ai's longevity within court circles suggests political adaptability. He had navigated the dramatic religious shift of Akhenaten without losing status. Such survival implies careful judgment. Supporting restoration under Tutankhamun would preserve his influence. Horemheb, on the other hand, may have viewed stability through a more pragmatic lens. Armies rely on clear leadership and reliable resources. A strong, unified religious structure reinforced morale and legitimacy. Together they stood near the young king during ceremonies. In reliefs from this period, A appears prominently, sometimes depicted with titles emphasizing his closeness to the royal family. He may have acted as a fatherly figure to Tutankhamun, guiding him through formal duties. Horemheb's proximity to the throne may have been less ceremonial, but equally significant. As commander, he represented the enforcement arm of the state. His loyalty would have reassured those concerned about external threats. Within the palace, the dynamic between these advisors and the boy king was likely structured yet subtle. Tutankhamun would have received instruction on how to sit, speak and move during official appearances. He would have observed councils where matters of temple funding or military readiness were discussed. Whether he fully understood each discussion is uncertain. What is clear is that decisions bearing his name reflected seasoned strategy. His background may also have connected him closely to the royal family. Some scholars suggest he may have been related to Nefertiti, possibly her father or another close relative. If so, his bond to the dynasty extended beyond administrative duty. That proximity positioned him well during moments of transition. The restoration of traditional religion did not unfold as chaotic reversal. It appeared measured, intentional. Such measured change reflects experienced guidance. The restoration stela and other inscriptions frame the king as pious restorer. Yet the logistics behind such restoration required coordination only veterans like I and Horemheb could provide. While outwardly unified, subtle tension may have existed between the two men. I represented continuity with the Amarna court. Horemheb represented military strength, potentially aligned with pre-Amarna traditions. Their ambitions, though initially aligned in service to the king, would later diverge. During Tutankhamun's lifetime, however, their shared interest was stability. The young king's health may have further increased their influence. If he struggled with mobility or illness, the burden of direct governance would naturally fall more heavily upon his advisors. Public image could be maintained, but private administration required endurance. I's age did not prevent him from exercising authority. His experience likely compensated for any physical limitation. Horemheb's energy complemented that experience, ensuring that Egypt's military and administrative arms functioned cohesively. In effect, Tutankhamun's reign can be viewed as a partnership. The king provided divine legitimacy. I and Horemheb provided operational strength. This arrangement was not unusual in Egyptian history. Child rulers often depended on regents or senior officials. What makes this period distinctive is the context. The kingdom was emerging from religious upheaval. The restoration required careful navigation. I likely played a central role in drafting inscriptions that frame the restoration as fulfillment of divine will rather than repudiation of Akhenaten. This framing avoided inflaming supporters of Aten while reassuring traditionalists. Horemheb's oversight of military structure may have included reasserting Egyptian presence in contested regions. Though records of specific campaigns during Tutankhamun's reign are limited, the image of strength needed reinforcement. The palace environment would have reflected this shared governance. Council meetings where A presented reports, briefings where Horemheb outlined security concerns, the young king listening, learning, participating as required. Over time, Tutankhamun likely grew more confident in his ceremonial role. Yet his reign was short. Roughly a decade after his accession, he died unexpectedly at around 19 years old. His sudden death transformed the balance behind the throne. With no surviving heir, succession became uncertain. Ankhesenamun's position as queen did not guarantee stability. The question of who would follow carried immense weight. A moved quickly. He assumed the throne after Tutankhamun's death, marrying Ankhesenamun to legitimize his claim. His reign, however, was brief. Within a few years, Horemheb succeeded him, establishing a new line that would work diligently to erase much of the Amarna period from official memory. The trajectory of these two advisors after Tutankhamun's death reveals that their ambitions extended beyond mere service. Yet during the boy king's lifetime, their roles appear collaborative. I ensured continuity of administration and religious restoration. Horemheb ensured continuity of military strength and external confidence. Together, they anchored a reign that might otherwise have faltered under the weight of youth and fragility. It is tempting to imagine Tutankhamun as a passive figure guided entirely by stronger personalities. The reality is likely more nuanced. Even a young king possessed agency within limits. He participated in ceremonies, approved decrees, and symbolized unity. Yet the hands that shape policy moved just behind his shoulders. Ancient Egyptian art often places advisors slightly smaller than the king, positioned respectfully at the edge of scenes. Their presence is acknowledged but subordinate. In life, the dynamic may have been similar. Visible authority remained with Tutankhamun. Operational authority flowed through experienced advisors. The restoration of temples, the return to traditional worship, the careful transition away from Amarna's exclusivity, all required steady guidance. Ayenhoremheb provided that steadiness. Their legacy is complex. Both would later play decisive roles in shaping Egypt's narrative of this period. The erasure of Akhenaten's memory, the repositioning of Tutankhamun as restorer, the consolidation of power after the boy king's death, all reflect long-term strategy. Yet within the span of Tutankhamun's brief reign, their presence ensured that a divided kingdom regained balance. Behind the throne stood experience, ambition, calculation, and loyalty interwoven. The boy king occupied the centre of the stage. Ayenhoremheb adjusted the backdrop, guided the script, and ensured that the performance of kingship unfolded without visible fracture, sustaining Egypt through transition and preparing the ground for the events that would follow after the young pharaoh's unexpectedly early death reshaped the future of both men and the kingdom they had helped steady. From a distance, royal life in ancient Egypt appears wrapped in gold and certainty. Walls covered in reliefs, floors polished smooth by servants' hands, linen garments fresh and white, perfumed air drifting through shaded halls. Yet within those walls, beneath the gleam of ornament and ceremony, daily life unfolded in rhythms that were structured, human, and sometimes fragile. Tutankhamun did not grow up in isolation from luxury. He was raised inside palaces designed to project divine authority. Even after the court began shifting away from Amarna, royal residences remained grand, whether in Memphis, Thebes, or temporary estates along the Nile. Columns painted in bright mineral pigments supported ceilings decorated with stars. Doorways were framed with carved lintels bearing the king's name. Every architectural detail reinforced the idea that the ruler stood at the centre of cosmic order. The palace was both home and stage. Inside, space was organised carefully. Public halls for audiences and ceremonies occupied the most visible areas. Private chambers lay deeper within, accessible only to trusted attendants. Storage rooms held textiles, oils, jewellery, and ritual objects. Kitchens bustled in distant wings, where servants prepared meals using grain, vegetables, fish, poultry, and fruit supplied from temple estates and royal lands. For Tutankhamun, the palace environment shifted as he transitioned from child to king. As a young boy, he would have spent much of his time under supervision. Nurses and caretakers guided him through routines. Tutors instructed him in reading hieroglyphs, reciting religious hymns, and understanding the responsibilities that awaited him. He learned court etiquette. He practiced speaking in measured tones. He memorized ritual phrases that affirmed his divine lineage. Education in the palace was not abstract. It prepared him for performance. Daily life followed a schedule shaped by ritual. At dawn, priests in temple complexes performed offerings to the gods. Though not physically present at every ceremony, the king's identity was invoked. Within the palace, smaller rituals likely occurred, reinforcing the connection between ruler and divine favour. Breakfast might consist of bread, fruit, and beer diluted with water. Royal kitchens produced food in abundance, yet diet remained relatively simple compared to modern expectations. Meat appeared on special occasions. Honey sweetened certain dishes. Wine from the delta or imported regions was reserved for formal gatherings. Tutankhamun's health may have influenced his daily rhythm. Evidence from his remains suggests he experienced physical limitations. Walking sticks discovered in his tomb show signs of use, indicating that movement was sometimes difficult. Within the palace, attendants would have assisted discreetly. Ramps may have replaced steep steps. Private chambers offered rest away from public view. Despite such challenges, royal iconography never depicted weakness. Reliefs show him standing tall before gods, holding ceremonial staffs, participating in hunts. The palace interior balanced that ideal image with practical accommodation. Tutankhamun, his queen, shared palace life. Their marriage reinforced royal continuity. As husband and wife, they appeared together in art, performing offerings and seated in formal posture. Within private quarters, their relationship may have contained moments of intimacy and shared youth. Both had grown up in the shadow of Akhenaten's revolution. Both experienced the shift back toward traditional worship. The palace housed more than the royal couple. Courtiers, officials, scribes, servants, guards, musicians and artisans formed a layered society within its walls. Each had defined roles. Some attended to clothing and jewellery. Others oversaw correspondence. Still others maintained the gardens. Gardens were essential features of royal estates. Shaded courtyards planted with sycamore trees, lotus pools reflecting sunlight, and carefully arranged flower beds offered respite from heat. The Nile's proximity ensured water supply. These green spaces softened the rigid geometry of palace architecture. Tutankhamun may have spent time in these gardens during quieter hours. The scent of lotus blossoms drifting across water, the sound of birds nesting in branches, moments of calm within a life framed by expectation. Entertainment in the palace included music and storytelling. Harpists performed during banquets. Dancers moved rhythmically before guests. Board games such as Senet provided diversion. Senet, associated symbolically with the journey to the afterlife, combined recreation with spiritual resonance. As king matured, his participation in public ceremonies increased. Processions through temple courts required careful choreography. The palace prepared him for these appearances. Garments of fine linen, sometimes pleated intricately, were fitted precisely. Jewellery of gold and semi-precious stones adorned neck and arms. Each ornament carried symbolic weight. Jewellery also had protective function. Amulets bearing images of deities were worn to guard against illness or misfortune. Considering the fragility of life in the ancient world, such protection was not ornamental alone. It was deeply believed. Within the palace, the restoration of traditional religion reshaped daily routines. Shrines dedicated to Amun and other gods were maintained. Priests consulted for auspicious timing of events. The atmosphere of singular devotion to Aten faded into layered practice. Administrative work continued in adjacent chambers. Scribes recorded taxation, agricultural yields, temple donations, and diplomatic correspondence. Papyrus scrolls passed through careful hands. Seals bearing the king's name authenticated decrees. Tutankhamun may have observed councils where Ai presented reports and Horemheb discussed military matters. Even if he did not command each decision, his presence conferred legitimacy. Listening became part of his education. Hunting expeditions formed another aspect of royal life. Whether he actively participated to the extent depicted in reliefs remains debated. Scenes show him driving a chariot, bow drawn toward fleeing animals. These images projected strength and mastery over chaos. If his physical limitations restricted direct involvement, staged hunts may have provided controlled environments for symbolic display. The palace also contained workshops where artisans crafted objects of astonishing precision. Goldsmiths shaped jewellery. Carpenters assembled furniture with intricate inlays. Painters applied vivid pigments to wood and plaster. Many of the treasures later discovered in his tomb likely began their creation within such spaces. Furniture found in his burial chamber reveals the comfort of palace life. Chairs with curved legs ending in lion paws, beds adorned with protective deities, chests decorated with scenes of victory and affection. These items were not abstract symbols. They were daily objects transferred into eternity. Life inside the palace included moments of uncertainty as well. The death of children, including possible daughters of Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, would have cast quiet shadows. 2 small mummified fetuses were found in his tomb, likely their daughters. Such loss was not uncommon in the ancient world, but within royal walls it carried both personal and dynastic implications. Heirs mattered. Continuity depended on successful succession. Medical care within the palace relied on herbal remedies, prayers and incantations. Physicians employed poultices and bandages. Spells were recited to invoke divine assistance. If the king suffered recurring illness, treatments would have combined practical and spiritual approaches. Evenings in the palace may have been quieter. Lamps fueled by oil cast warm light across painted walls. Conversation softened. Musicians played gentle melodies. The Nile beyond palace grounds moved steadily in darkness. Despite grandeur, palace life was structured by duty. Each day carried expectation. The king was visible embodiment of Egypt's stability. Even within private chambers, awareness of that role lingered. As years passed, Tutankhamun grew from child to adolescent to young man. His features matured slightly. His voice deepened. His understanding of court politics likely sharpened. Yet his reign remained brief. Within the Golden Palace, he experienced both privilege and constraint. He wore fine linen yet bore weight of divine title. He walked shaded corridors yet stood at the centre of public ritual. He shared private moments with his queen yet remained symbol to millions. The palace did not isolate him from the consequences of governance. Reports of temple reconstruction, foreign tensions and administrative adjustments flowed continually. His signature sealed decisions affecting distant provinces he might never personally visit. When illness or injury struck, as some evidence suggests may have occurred late in his life, the palace became a place of treatment and vigil. Advisors likely monitored his condition. Ankhesenamun remained close. Priests performed protective rites. The golden surfaces that gleam in museum displays today reflect a life that was not merely decorative. They reflect hours spent learning posture and prayer. They reflect evenings in lamplit halls. They reflect a youth shaped by ritual and responsibility. Within those walls, the boy king became the young pharaoh whose identity fused childhood and sovereignty. The palace sheltered him, instructed him, and displayed him. It provided comfort and demanded composure. And as the restored temples beyond its gates hummed once more with incense and chant, life inside the Golden Palace continued its measured rhythm, preparing the king for ceremonies yet to come, and for challenges that would soon test the resilience of a reign still unfolding beneath ceilings, painted with stars and corridors lined with the quiet footsteps of attendants, moving softly in service to a sovereign whose time within those walls was shorter than anyone could have anticipated. Royal marriage in ancient Egypt was never a simple matter of companionship. It was strategy, continuity, theology, and survival woven into a single union. When Tutankhamun married Ankhesenamun, later known as Ankhesenamun, their partnership was shaped as much by politics as by youth. They were both children of the Amarna world, raised beneath the rays of the Aten, and both would grow into adulthood during the careful restoration of Egypt's older traditions. Ankhesenamun was almost certainly one of Akhenaten's daughters, likely born to Nefertiti. That meant she and Tutankhamun were close relatives, perhaps half-siblings. Such unions were not unusual within the royal family. Marriage between siblings reinforced divine legitimacy. The pharaoh was seen as a living Horus, heir to Osiris, and divine bloodlines were preserved through controlled lineage. Their wedding did not unfold as a romantic gesture in the modern sense. It was ceremony and calculation. It ensured that the throne remained within the established family. It prevented external factions from inserting alternative claimants. It strengthened the perception that the restoration underway was still anchored to royal continuity rather than rebellion. At the time of their marriage, both were still very young. Tutankhamun may have been around 9 or 10 when crowned, and the marriage likely followed soon after, though exact dates remain debated. Ankhesenaten herself would have been of similar age. Their early years together unfolded within the palace environment, already defined by ritual, supervision, and expectation. Her name, like his, carried ideological meaning. Ankhesenaten meant, "she lives through the Aten." It reflected the singular devotion that shaped her childhood. When the court shifted direction and traditional gods regained prominence, her name changed as well. Ankhesenamun, "she lives through Amun." The alteration mirrored Tutankhamun's transformation. Together they embodied restoration. The change in her name was more than cosmetic. As great royal wife, she participated in temple rituals alongside the king. Reliefs depict her standing near him, presenting offerings, sometimes touching him gently in scenes of domestic intimacy that recall the softer style of Amarna art. Yet the context had shifted. These scenes now unfolded within the framework of restored tradition. Marriage within the palace brought both comfort and pressure. Ankhesenamun was not merely consort. She represented dynastic stability. The expectation of producing an heir weighed heavily. Without a clear successor, political uncertainty could emerge quickly. Evidence from Tutankhamun's tomb suggests that the couple experienced at least 2 pregnancies that did not result in surviving children. 2 small mummified fetuses were discovered within the burial chamber, likely their daughters. Modern analysis indicates they were born prematurely or died shortly after birth. The presence of those small coffins adds a quiet layer of sorrow to the royal story. Within palace walls decorated in gold and lapis, grief would have been felt privately. The loss of children was not uncommon in the ancient world, but for a royal couple, it carried political consequences as well as personal pain. Without a surviving heir, the question of succession remained unresolved. Ankhesenamun's role within the palace extended beyond motherhood. She appeared publicly during festivals and ceremonies, reinforcing the image of unified leadership. The queen in ancient Egypt held significant symbolic power. She could act as priestess, intermediary, and stabilizing presence beside the king. Reliefs from this period show scenes of tenderness between Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun that differ from the rigid formality of earlier dynasties. In one famous depiction on the back of the king's golden throne, the queen is shown applying ointment to her husband beneath the rays of the Aten, a lingering stylistic echo of their childhood environment. The scene conveys intimacy and partnership. That artistic choice is striking. Even as the court restored traditional worship, traces of Amarna's emphasis on familial closeness remained. The throne image suggests that within palace life, affection was not entirely concealed behind protocol. Their shared upbringing under Akhenaten may have fostered a unique bond. Both had witnessed the shift from Aten exclusivity to broader tradition. Both had adapted their names and identities. In an environment shaped by political recalibration, mutual understanding may have provided comfort. Yet their union unfolded within uncertain times. The restoration of traditional religion strengthened the kingdom, but it did not erase all tension. Advisors like Ai and Horemheb maintained strong influence. Foreign affairs required attention. The couple stood at the centre of a court navigating careful balance. Within private chambers, life may have been quieter. Ankhesenamun likely oversaw aspects of palace management, supervising servants, and ensuring proper preparation for ceremonies. She would have worn elaborate jewellery during public appearances, her headdresses reflecting both divine symbolism and royal status. Medical care for pregnancies would have combined practical remedies with incantations. Amulets shaped like Taweret, goddess of childbirth, may have been worn for protection. Priests invoked divine favour. The loss of infants would have triggered both ritual mourning and political concern. As Tutankhamun matured into his later teenage years, their marriage transitioned from childhood arrangement into adult partnership. Whether affection deepened cannot be measured with certainty, The artistic record suggests warmth. The reality may have included both closeness and shared burden. Ankhesenamun's influence becomes especially evident after Tutankhamun's death. But even during his life, her presence reinforced continuity. The Golden Palace housed their shared experiences, banquets attended together, festivals where they stood side by side, moments of quiet beyond public gaze. In those spaces, they were not only king and queen, but two young individuals navigating expectations imposed since birth. The uncertainty of their times extended beyond religious restoration. Egypt's empire required vigilance. Military oversight under Horemheb remained active. Temple rebuilding projects demanded resources. The couple embodied stability even as external and internal challenges persisted. Their marriage symbolized healing. The shift from a ten-centered identity to a moon-aligned restoration unfolded through their names and their public appearances. Together they reassured priests and populace alike that continuity had not broken. Yet the fragility of life lingered. Tutankhamun's health remained uncertain. Evidence of injury or illness late in his life raises questions about sudden decline. Within palace walls, Ankhesenamun may have witnessed periods of weakness or recovery. Advisors would have monitored the situation closely, aware that absence of heir intensified risk. The bond between them thus carried urgency. Producing a living successor would have secured their line and stabilized succession. That hope remained unfulfilled. In art, Ankhesenamun appears poised and composed, her gaze steady, her posture balanced. Yet beneath that composure likely lay awareness of shifting ground. The desert beyond palace walls remained vast and silent. Within, the royal couple performed roles shaped by tradition and necessity. Their marriage did not exist apart from politics. It was politics embodied. When Tutankhamun died unexpectedly at around 19, Ankhesenamun faced an abrupt transformation. As widow without heir, her position became precarious. Evidence suggests she may have written to the Hittite king requesting a foreign prince as husband, an extraordinary and risky act. That letter, if authentic, reveals desperation and uncertainty. But during the years before that crisis, their marriage represented hope. Hope that restoration would endure. Hope that continuity would be secured. Hope that the kingdom's division would remain healed. Inside the palace, beneath ceilings painted with constellations, Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun stood together as symbols of a generation raised in upheaval, yet committed to balance. Their names carried that transformation. Their union reflected it. And as temple incense rose once more across Egypt, and festivals resumed their familiar rhythms, the royal couple moved through ceremonies hand in hand, presenting offerings to gods both ancient and newly restored, embodying a fragile yet determined continuity that would soon be tested by events neither of them could fully foresee, as the stability their marriage symbolized rested on foundations more delicate than the golden surfaces that surrounded them. For a time, the desert city of Akhetaten had stood at the center of Egypt's world. Its temples opened directly to the sky. Its avenues stretched between freshly cut cliffs and newly raised palaces. Its walls carried reliefs unlike anything that had come before, elongated forms and intimate family scenes beneath the rays of the Aegean. It was not layered with centuries of memory. It was deliberate, purpose-built, a statement in stone that Egypt's spiritual and political heart had shifted. Yet statements do not always endure. As Tutankhamun's reign progressed and the restoration of traditional worship gained momentum, the question of the capital could not be avoided. Akhetaten had been created to serve a singular theology. It existed because Akhenaten wished to distance himself from Thebes and its powerful priesthood of Amun. If Amun was returning to prominence, then remaining in a city dedicated exclusively to the Aten carried symbolic contradiction. The capital's gradual return to older centres was not dramatic. There was no sudden evacuation, no visible abandonment overnight. Instead, administrative focus began to move quietly. Memphis, long a political hub near the Nile Delta, regained importance. Thebes, with its immense temple complex at Karnak and deep spiritual heritage, reasserted itself. These cities were not experimental, they were layered. Their streets and temples had witnessed generations of rulers. Their priesthoods held memory and influence. The return to Thebes carried profound symbolic weight. Thebes was not merely another city. It was the seat of Amun's cult. Its towering pylons and massive hypostyle halls represented centuries of devotion. During Akhenaten's reforms, its influence had been deliberately curtailed. Temples had been neglected. Priests had lost status. The shift to Akhetaten had diminished Thebes' standing. When Tutankhamun aligned his name with Amun, the road back to Thebes opened naturally. Restoring the capital to Thebes did not require new construction on the scale of Amarna's rapid rise. The infrastructure already existed. The temple stood ready to receive renewed offerings. Administrative offices could resume function within established structures. For the young king, returning to Thebes meant stepping into a city heavy with legacy. Unlike Amarna, which bore the marks of recent creation, Thebes carried weight. Its monuments were reminders of powerful ancestors. The Temple of Karnak, expanded over centuries, dwarfed individual ambition. Reliefs carved long before his birth depicted earlier pharaohs in triumphant poses. Living and ruling within such an environment reinforced continuity. The palace arrangements likely shifted accordingly. Residences in Memphis and Thebes would have housed the royal family during periods of ceremony and governance. Movement along the Nile connected these centres. Royal barges transported court and officials between cities, the river serving as both highway and symbol of unity. The physical return to Thebes paralleled the theological restoration underway. Priests of Amun regained their central role in state ritual. Festivals such as the Opet celebration, which linked Karnak to Luxor Temple through grand processions, resumed with full ceremonial weight. During these festivals, statues of Amun were carried along prescribed routes, accompanied by music, incense, and crowds of onlookers. The king participated, reinforcing his connection to the god whose name he now bore. Such public ritual restored a rhythm interrupted during the height of Aten's exclusivity. For ordinary citizens, the capital's return meant familiar structures of authority were visible once more. The city that had anchored their grandparents' lives regained prominence. Markets reopened near temple complexes. Craftsmen resumed work under patronage of traditional institutions. The gradual decline of Akhetaten began almost immediately once the court shifted focus. Without royal presence, its significance waned. Administrative offices closed, workshops relocated, temples open to the sun received fewer offerings. Sand began its slow reclamation. Stones from its buildings were eventually dismantled and reused in other construction projects. The city built in fervour became quarry. Its horizon of Aten faded into memory. This process was not necessarily vindictive during Tutankhamun's lifetime. The aim was stability rather than erasure. Later rulers would be more deliberate in removing traces of Akhenaten's experiment. During the boy king's reign, the emphasis remained on restoration. Within Thebes, temple construction resumed under his name. Reliefs show Tutankhamun offering to Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. The visual language returned to established conventions. The elongated forms of Amarna art softened into traditional proportion. The capital's return also strengthened the relationship between crown and priesthood. Temple estates once again controlled significant resources. Their loyalty reinforced the throne. In a kingdom emerging from ideological division, such reinforcement mattered. The move carried diplomatic implications as well. Foreign envoys accustomed to Thebes' grandeur would find familiar surroundings. A capital anchored in tradition projected confidence. The experiment of Amarna, though innovative, may have appeared uncertain to external observers. For Tutankhamun, residing in Thebes meant inhabiting spaces shaped by ancestors whose reigns had extended decades. His own reign remained brief. Walking through Karnak's vast columns, he would have been dwarfed by the scale of history surrounding him. Yet that scale offered protection. The boy king's youth mattered less within a city that symbolized permanence. The institution of kingship felt larger than any individual. Ankhesenamun's presence alongside him reinforced continuity. Together they appeared in temple scenes, performing rituals long practiced. Their shared transformation from Aten-aligned identities to Amun-aligned figures became embodied within Thebes' sacred walls. Life within the returning capital likely followed patterns refined over generations. Administrative councils met within established halls. Priests conducted daily offerings in inner sanctuaries. The Nile's annual flood continued to dictate agricultural cycles. The contrast between Amarna and Thebes remained stark. Amarna had been open, experimental, suffused with direct sunlight. Thebes was layered, shaded, echoing with centuries of chant. Its architecture enclosed rather than exposed. Its sanctuaries were dark, mysterious, housing statues concealed from public view. In returning to Thebes, Egypt returned to mystery rather than visibility. The Aten's open disk gave way to hidden divine presence, accessible only through ritual mediation. For the young king, this shift marked completion of restoration. His identity no longer hovered between two worlds. It settled firmly within the traditional framework of Egyptian spirituality. Thebes offered stability at a time when personal and political uncertainties persisted. The absence of a clear heir, the fragility of Tutankhamun's health, and the ambitions of advisors required grounding in tradition. The capital's return provided that grounding. Over time, Akhenaten's memory dimmed. Its name faded from official records. Its temples fell silent. Thebes regained its position as spiritual heart. Memphis retained administrative importance. Egypt's political geography returned to familiar contours. Yet the memory of Amarna lingered quietly in the stone fragments reused in later walls. The experiment was not entirely erased. It was absorbed. Tutankhamun's reign thus became associated not with innovation, but with restoration of established order. The capital's return to Thebes symbolized that restoration more clearly than any inscription. Within Thebes' immense temple complexes, the boy king stood in scenes carved for eternity, offering to gods whose names had endured for millennia. The city that had once felt sidelined now welcomed him as rightful mediator between divine and mortal realms. And as the Nile flowed past its banks beneath warm Egyptian sun, the capital settled once more into rhythms shaped long before Akhenaten's bright horizon had risen, anchoring Tutankhamun's reign within tradition and carrying his story forward within walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of many rulers. Even as his own time within those ancient precincts moved steadily toward an end none within the restored capital could yet fully foresee. When a kingdom shifts direction, the change is first written in names and decrees. Then it must be written in stone. For Tutankhamun, restoration did not end with reopening temples or returning the court to Thebes. It required visible action. Walls had to rise, statues had to stand again, gods had to be placed back within sanctuaries that had grown quiet. Egypt was not shattered in a physical sense, but its spiritual and political framework had been strained. Repairing that strain meant building and rebuilding in ways the population could see. Construction in ancient Egypt was not merely practical, it was declarative. A temple facade bearing a king's cartouche announced legitimacy. A restored shrine declared divine favour. Even small additions to existing complexes signalled participation in a lineage stretching backward through centuries. Tutankhamun's reign was brief, and his resources were not limitless. He did not attempt projects on the scale of earlier rulers who had enjoyed decades of stability. Instead, his building efforts were targeted and symbolic. They focused on repairing what had been neglected and reinforcing what had been shaken. In Karnak, the vast temple complex of Amun, construction resumed under his authority. Reliefs show him presenting offerings to Amun, Mut, and Khonsu. Columns and pylons that had suffered from neglect during the height of Aten worship were refurbished. Inscriptions emphasize restoration rather than innovation. The language suggests that the gods, once abandoned, had been invited back into their homes. These acts carried political weight. The priesthood of Amun regained economic and social power through temple restoration. Temple estates once again managed land and labour. By supporting these institutions, Tutankhamun strengthened the alliance between throne and clergy. Building also functioned as memory management. The Amarna period had introduced an artistic style distinct from traditional Egyptian representation. Elongated limbs, intimate family scenes, and the singular prominence of the Aten characterized its reliefs. Under Tutankhamun, artistic conventions gradually returned to earlier norms. Proportions stabilized. The king appeared in formal stance before multiple deities. The visual language of continuity replaced the experimental tone of his father's reign. Repairing monuments did not necessarily mean erasing every trace of the past. In many cases, stone blocks from dismantled Aten temples were reused in constructing traditional sanctuaries. The material of revolution became the material of restoration. This blending reflects practicality, but it also symbolizes absorption rather than total rejection. Elsewhere in Egypt, smaller temples received attention. Shrines damaged or neglected were re-sanctified. Priests resumed daily offerings. Inscriptions recorded that the king had made the gods dwell in their houses once more. The phrasing implies relationship. The gods had not abandoned Egypt entirely, but their houses had grown quiet. The young king presented himself as host, welcoming them home. Memphis also benefited from renewed building. As an administrative centre, it required functional structures, workshops, storage facilities, and residential quarters for officials were maintained and improved. Repairing administrative infrastructure ensured that governance operated smoothly alongside religious revival. Beyond temple walls, building projects extended to statues and stelae placed in public spaces. Such monuments reminded citizens of the king's piety and authority. Even modest constructions reinforced the narrative that Egypt had returned to proper order. Healing a fractured kingdom required more than stonework. It required memory shaping. Official inscriptions during Tutankhamun's reign frame the preceding period as one of neglect rather than condemnation. The rhetoric avoids explicit attack on Akhenaten. Instead, it speaks of restoration of Ma'at, the divine balance. This careful framing prevented further division. The aim was unity, not recrimination. The concept of Ma'at governed Egyptian understanding of cosmic order. It encompassed truth, balance, and justice. When temples were neglected and rituals disrupted, Ma'at was believed to suffer. By repairing shrines and resuming offerings, Tutankhamun symbolically restored Ma'at. Such symbolism mattered deeply. Egypt's identity rested on continuity. The Nile's flood cycle reinforced predictability. Temple rituals reinforced divine favour. Disruption threatened both spiritual and agricultural confidence. Building, therefore, became medicine. For the population, seeing craftsmen at work on temple facades and hearing chants resume within sanctuaries reinforced reassurance. Festivals that had been diminished returned with full procession. The Opet festival once again carried a moon statue between Karnak and Luxor. Music and celebration filled streets. These communal experiences repaired social fabric. Within the palace, artisans crafted objects that reflected both reverence and refinement. The golden throne discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb, with its scene of intimate interaction between king and queen, demonstrates high craftsmanship. Even in restoration, artistic creativity continued. Some items found in his tomb appear to have been repurposed or altered from earlier use. Names were reinscribed, symbols modified. This suggests that resources were managed carefully. The reign was not one of excess expansion, but of strategic reallocation. Healing also extended to foreign relations. While records of extensive campaigns during Tutankhamun's reign are limited, reliefs depict him in traditional warrior pose, smiting enemies. Such imagery reaffirmed Egypt's strength. Diplomatic correspondence likely continued, maintaining alliances and vassal relationships. Horemheb's role as general ensured that military readiness remained visible. A kingdom secure at its borders projects internal confidence. Within Thebes, the scale of Karnak's complex dwarfed the contributions of a short reign. Yet even small additions carried symbolic importance. A column inscribed with Tutankhamun's name placed him within a continuum of rulers who had expanded the temple over centuries. Memory in ancient Egypt was curated carefully. Kings sought to ensure their names endured through inscriptions and monuments. For Tutankhamun, building projects anchored his identity to restoration. He would not be remembered as revolutionary, but as healer. The brevity of his reign limited grand ambition, yet its focused efforts shaped the narrative that followed. Later rulers would intensify the erasure of Akhenaten's legacy, chiseling away his name from monuments and excluding him from king lists. Under Tutankhamun, the approach remained moderate, restoration rather than obliteration. In this way, his building projects bridged past and future. Repairing temples reaffirmed tradition, reinscribing names signalled legitimacy, reviving festivals restored communal rhythm. The kingdom's fracture, though never violent in the visible sense, was mended through repetition of ancient patterns. The visual language of art shifted decisively away from Amarna's experimentation. Faces became more symmetrical, bodies more proportioned. Scenes of gods resumed their layered complexity. The Aten's exclusive rays no longer dominated compositions. Within these aesthetic adjustments lay deeper healing. Identity stabilized. Tutankhamun's own participation in ceremonies reinforced the narrative. Even if physically fragile, he stood before deities in carved reliefs, holding offering trays, raising hands in devotion. The image of the king remained central to maintaining Ma'at. Over time, the memory of Akhenaten's experiment softened into anomaly. Tutankhamun's reign became the pivot that turned Egypt back toward familiarity. In workshops and quarries, stonecutters and artisans laboured to make that pivot visible. Blocks were measured, reliefs chiselled, paint applied, priests supervised consecration rituals. Incense smoke filled sanctuaries reopened after years of relative quiet. The kingdom breathed more easily. Building and repairing may seem practical acts, yet in ancient Egypt they were deeply symbolic. Each restored shrine affirmed that divine presence had not abandoned the land. Each inscription bearing Tutankhamun's name embedded him within the sacred architecture of continuity. The boy who had inherited division now presided over renewal. His life remained short and his health uncertain, but the structures erected and repaired under his authority carried weight beyond his years. They signalled that Egypt's identity was not permanently altered by a decade of singular devotion. It could absorb shock and return to balance. As the Nile continued its steady flood and fields along its banks grew green once more, the work of building and remembering unfolded quietly across temple complexes and administrative halls, weaving restoration into stone and ritual so that the fractured edges of recent memory softened, and the young king's reign stood as a bridge between experiment and endurance, preparing the ground for events still to come as his own strength gradually waned beneath the steady gaze of gods whose houses had been made whole again. No matter how many temples were repaired or names reinscribed, one presence lingered quietly behind Tutankhamun's reign. It was not carved prominently on new monuments. It did not stand beside him in restored reliefs, yet it remained, shaping perception and memory. The presence was his father. Akhenaten's shadow did not disappear when the capital shifted, or when Amun's name returned to prominence. A revolution of belief leaves traces that cannot be erased simply by chiselling away hieroglyphs. For Tutankhamun, that shadow was both personal and political. He had been born into his father's vision. His earliest identity, even his birth name, reflected exclusive devotion to the Aten. His childhood unfolded within a city built specifically to distance itself from Thebes. The theology that shaped his early education was not layered and traditional, but focused and radical. As he matured and took steps to restore older practices, he did so while carrying the bloodline of the man who had disrupted them. This duality defined much of his reign. Public inscriptions during Tutankhamun's rule did not openly condemn Akhenaten. They spoke instead of neglect, of temples fallen silent, of gods whose houses required renewal. The language avoided direct accusation. Such restraints suggest awareness that denouncing the previous king too forcefully might fracture legitimacy. After all, Akhenaten had been pharaoh. He had ruled lawfully, even if controversially. To condemn him outright would risk undermining the continuity that made Tutankhamun's own claim secure. Yet the restoration efforts inevitably positioned the son as corrective to the father. The boy king's identity gradually became defined in contrast. Where Akhenaten elevated a single god, Tutankhamun embraced many. Where the father built a new capital in the desert, the son returned to cities layered with tradition. Where art under Akhenaten stretched proportions and emphasized intimacy, Tutankhamun's era restored formal balance. The shadow was visible not through direct confrontation, but through difference. Within the palace, memory of Akhenaten would have been unavoidable. Courtiers who had served the father now served the son. Advisors like A had stood in proximity to both rulers. The transition required careful navigation. Personal loyalties and political necessity intertwined. Tutankhamun likely remembered his father not as theological disruptor, but as parent. The reliefs of Amarna depict Akhenaten in moments of domestic closeness with his children. Whether those scenes reflected reality or idealized imagery, they suggest that family presence mattered. For a young king correcting his father's policies, the emotional dimension must have been complex. Restoration required subtle distancing, yet filial connection remained. The physical remnants of Akhenaten's reign complicated matters further. Temples dedicated to the Aten still stood during Tutankhamun's early years. The city of Akhetaten remained inhabited before gradual abandonment. Erasing every trace was impractical, at least initially. Instead, the approach appears measured. Names of Amun that had been removed were recarved. Aten's prominence faded without immediate destruction. Only later, under Horemheb and subsequent rulers, would systematic erasure intensify. During Tutankhamun's lifetime, the emphasis remained on restoration rather than purge. This cautious strategy may reflect the delicate balance between legitimacy and reform. Tutankhamun could not entirely repudiate the dynasty from which he sprang. The shadow extended beyond religion into foreign affairs. During Akhenaten's later years, Egypt's influence in certain territories weakened. Vassal states sent letters requesting military aid. Some pleas went unanswered. Whether due to internal focus or strategic recalculation, the perception of decline lingered. Tutankhamun's reign sought to project renewed strength. Reliefs depict him in traditional warrior pose, smiting enemies, even if his personal involvement in campaigns remains uncertain. The image countered any suggestion that Egypt had become inward-looking or vulnerable. In this way, the son's portrayal corrected the father's perceived neglect. Art under Tutankhamun further illustrates the dynamic. The exaggerated features characteristic of Amarna art gradually softened. The king appears in more conventional posture, aligned with earlier dynasties. Divine figures surrounding him are multiple, not singular. The visual message was unmistakable. Egypt had returned to its layered pantheon and balanced representation. Yet Amarna's influence did not vanish entirely. The golden throne found in Tutankhamun's tomb carries an intimate scene reminiscent of earlier style. The queen touches the king gently beneath rays of the Aten. That imagery suggests that even as restoration unfolded publicly, traces of the previous aesthetic and theology lingered privately. The shadow thus existed both as memory and as residue. Within court politics, the legacy of Akhenaten likely influenced succession planning. Without a surviving heir, the future of the dynasty remained uncertain. Advisors who had served both father and son positioned themselves carefully. I, deeply embedded in Amarna's court, stood ready to assume authority after Tutankhamun's death. Horemheb, representing military strength and pre-Amarna continuity, would later follow. Their eventual actions indicate that the shadow of Akhenaten shaped ambitions as well as policies. For Tutankhamun, the task was immediate rather than long-term. He needed to stabilize the present. The temple restoration projects, the return to Thebes, and the resumption of traditional festivals all functioned as counterbalance to the father's singular vision. Yet they were framed as healing rather than rejection. It is telling that Tutankhamun's tomb contained objects that may have originally been crafted during the Amarna period. Some items appear repurposed, reinscribed with his name. The material culture of his burial reflects transition. He carried forward fragments of his father's world even as he redefined it. The brevity of his life prevented a fully mature reckoning with that inheritance. He died around 19, leaving behind a kingdom stabilized but not entirely free of recent memory. Later rulers would intensify efforts to erase Akhenaten's name from monuments and king lists. Horemheb in particular worked to reposition himself as legitimate successor of earlier orthodox rulers, bypassing the Amarna phase. In that later erasure, Tutankhamun's own memory became partially obscured. Ironically, the son who restored balance would himself fade from record for millennia until his tomb was discovered. The shadow of Akhenaten thus extended forward beyond Tutankhamun's lifetime. It influenced how subsequent generations curated history. It shaped which names endured and which were omitted. For the boy king himself, the shadow was immediate and personal. He stood at the intersection of two worlds, the bright experiment of Aten and the deep tradition of Amun. His childhood belonged to one, his kingship belonged to the other. Navigating that intersection required restraint. Too much repudiation could fracture legitimacy. Too little correction could perpetuate instability. Through measured restoration, Tutankhamun balanced memory and reform. He allowed Egypt to step away from exclusivity without declaring war on its recent past. Within the palace, advisors likely reminded him of precedent. Ritual scripts returned to traditional phrasing. The presence of multiple gods in ceremony reinforced layered belief. The weight of history in Thebes' temples anchored him in continuity. Yet somewhere within that continuity remained the memory of a father who had once declared a different horizon. The desert cliffs of Amarna still bore carved boundary stelae, proclaiming Akhenaten's devotion to Aten. They stood as silent testimony to a chapter that could not be fully erased. Tutankhamun's reign did not seek to dismantle those cliffs stone by stone. It sought to build elsewhere, to reinforce older foundations. The shadow did not vanish. It softened, receding into background as restored rituals filled temple halls and familiar hymns echoed once more. And as the young king continued his brief journey through adolescence into early adulthood, he carried within him both the imprint of radical sunlight and the steady weight of ancient tradition, embodying the tension between experiment and endurance while standing in temples, reclaimed for Amun, even as the memory of Akhenaten's solitary son lingered quietly at the edges of Egypt's restored horizon. Royal art presents certainty. The king stands tall, broad-shouldered, composed before the gods. He draws his bow with steady strength. He rides in his chariot with flawless balance. He offers incense without hesitation. On temple walls and carved reliefs, Tutankhamun appears no different. Youthful, upright, divinely assured. Yet beneath linen garments and golden regalia was a body that may have been far more fragile than those images suggest. Modern examinations of Tutankhamun's mummy have revealed details that complicate the portrait of a vigorous young ruler. CT scans conducted in the early 21st century exposed skeletal irregularities. His left foot appears to have suffered from a deformity, possibly clubfoot. Evidence suggests bone tissue damage in the foot consistent with a vascular necrosis, a condition that restricts blood supply and weakens structure. Such a condition would have caused pain and instability when walking. The discovery of over 100 walking sticks in his tomb, many showing signs of actual use rather than ceremonial decoration, reinforces the possibility that mobility was a persistent challenge. These were not merely symbolic items placed for eternity. The wear on their tips suggests daily reliance. For a pharaoh whose image depended on strength, such reliance required careful concealment. Ancient Egyptian kingship was built on the principle that the ruler embodied divine vitality. The pharaoh was Horus in life, Osiris in death. Physical weakness did not align easily with that theology. Court artists ensured that official depictions reflected ideal form rather than anatomical reality. Within palace walls, however, the truth would have been visible. If Tutankhamun walked with difficulty, attendants likely assisted discreetly. Ramps may have eased transitions between chambers. During long ceremonies, opportunities for seated posture would have been arranged. Public processions required careful planning to preserve appearance of effortless authority. Beyond skeletal deformities, genetic analysis has suggested that Tutankhamun carried markers of inherited conditions common in royal lineages shaped by close kin marriages. His parents were likely siblings. Such unions reinforced divine bloodlines but increased risk of congenital disorders. Examination of his remains indicates possible cleft palate and slight scoliosis. None of these conditions alone would necessarily prevent kingship, but together they paint a picture of physical vulnerability. Illness may have compounded these challenges. Evidence of malaria parasites was detected in tissue samples, suggesting he experienced infection at some point. Malaria in ancient Egypt was not uncommon, especially in regions near standing water. Recurrent bouts could weaken even a healthy individual. For someone already managing skeletal pain, infection would have been taxing. There is also evidence of a fracture in his left leg. Earlier theories suggested foul play, imagining assassination or violent accident. Modern analysis indicates the fracture likely occurred shortly before death and may have been accidental, whether sustained in a fall during chariot activity or from other misstep remains uncertain. If the injury became infected in a world without antibiotics, complications could escalate quickly. Within the palace, royal physicians would have attended him. Egyptian medicine combined practical treatment with spiritual incantation. Honey, known for its antibacterial properties, was applied to wounds. Herbal poultices reduced inflammation. Spells invoking protective deities accompanied physical remedies. Tutankhamun's medical care would have been among the most attentive available in his era. Yet ancient medicine had limits. The image of him as active hunter and charioteer remains preserved in reliefs and objects found in his tomb. Some scholars argue that these scenes represent royal symbolism rather than literal record. Others suggest he may have participated in controlled hunts, perhaps from a chariot modified for stability. The presence of chariots in his tomb indicates at least symbolic association with mobility and martial prowess. Whether his physical condition restricted sustained activity is debated. Pain may have been constant companion. A vascular necrosis can cause persistent discomfort. Walking long distances without support would have been difficult. Standing for extended ritual could strain joints. The responsibilities of kingship did not pause for bodily limitation. Within private quarters, relief from pain may have come through massage, herbal treatments, or rest. Yet as pharaoh, he could not withdraw entirely from public expectation. His youth intensifies the poignancy of these findings. Tutankhamun died around 19 years old. Adolescence and early adulthood are typically associated with vitality. To imagine that those years were marked by chronic pain reframes his reign. The fragile body of a pharaoh contrasts sharply with the golden mask that now symbolizes him. The mask's serene expression conveys eternal composure. It conceals the reality that its wearer may have walked with difficulty and endured illness. His short lifespan further underscores fragility. Whether malaria, infection from fracture, genetic complications, or combination of factors caused his death remains debated. What seems likely is that his body, already managing multiple stressors, could not overcome acute trauma or disease. Within palace corridors, the atmosphere during his final illness must have been tense. Tutankhamun likely remained close. Advisors such as and Horemheb would have monitored the situation carefully. Without a surviving heir, the king's health carried implications beyond personal loss. Priests would have intensified rituals invoking deities associated with healing and protection. Incense smoke-filled chambers, offerings multiplied. Yet divine favour did not guarantee recovery. The fragility of his body contrasts with the stability he worked to restore in Egypt. Temples reopened, festivals resumed, political order steadied, yet the vessel embodying that stability was vulnerable. The concept of divine kingship required that the pharaoh be seen as physically capable. The reality that Tutankhamun may have relied on canes does not diminish his authority. It humanizes it. His burial equipment reflects awareness of physical limitation. Walking sticks were included not merely as symbols, but as practical tools for afterlife journey. The inclusion suggests acceptance that mobility mattered beyond this life. The two small, mummified fetuses found in his tomb add another layer to bodily fragility. The inability to produce surviving heirs may have stemmed from shared genetic factors. Royal lineage preserved divine identity, but also risked compounding vulnerability. Ancient Egyptians understood illness through both medical and spiritual lenses. Disease could be caused by imbalance, malevolent forces, or divine displeasure. Protective amulets placed within Tutankhamun's wrappings reflect desire to guard him even in death. The mummification process preserved his body carefully. Resins and oils were applied, organs removed and placed in canopic jars under guardianship of protective deities. The preparation reflected reverence, not merely ritual compliance. His body, though fragile in life, was prepared for eternity with meticulous care. The discovery of his mummy in 1922 revealed damage inflicted by ancient embalmers and later tomb intrusion, but the essential form remained intact. Modern imaging allowed scholars to reconstruct aspects of his physical condition with remarkable detail. Each scan, each analysis reveals the contrast between divine image and human reality. Illness and injury did not prevent Tutankhamun from fulfilling ceremonial obligations. He appeared in reliefs, authorized building projects, participated in restoration. His reign, though brief, achieved stability in a period of transition, yet his body placed limits on how long he could continue. The golden surfaces of his burial treasures distract easily from the young man beneath them. The ornate coffins nested within one another suggest invulnerability. The serene musk suggests calm permanence. But beneath the layers of gold was a skeleton marked by deformity and possible infection. The fragile body of a pharaoh reminds us that divine titles did not override biology. When he died, likely suddenly, the kingdom faced renewed uncertainty. The restoration he embodied continued, but the youth at its centre was gone. His physical vulnerability may have deepened the urgency of restoration during his lifetime. Aware of a limited strength, he and his advisors moved efficiently to stabilize religious and political structures. The walking sticks found beside him tell a quiet story. They are not objects of conquest. They are tools of support. They speak of effort, adaptation, perseverance. Tutankhamun's reign thus carries dual image. Outwardly, the confident young ruler restoring tradition. Inwardly, a body negotiating pain and limitation. And as his final days unfolded within palace chambers attended by physicians and priests, the golden image that would endure for millennia was already being shaped, even as the fragile human life beneath it slipped quietly away, leaving behind a kingdom steadied but a throne once again empty, preparing the way for events that would follow his untimely death in a land where divine kingship could not prevent the quiet certainty of mortality. No one in the palace expected it to happen so quickly. Tutankhamun had reigned for nearly a decade. The temples had reopened, the capital had shifted, the rituals had resumed their familiar rhythm. Though still young, he had grown from child into adolescent, and then into a young man approaching adulthood. His voice would have deepened, his features sharpened. The role of pharaoh no longer rested solely on a boy's shoulders, but on someone beginning to inhabit authority with greater familiarity. And then, at around 19 years old, he died. The suddenness of his death is one of the defining features of his story. There are no long records of decline, no detailed inscriptions describing extended illness. The transition appears abrupt. One season he was king, the next he was being prepared for burial. For centuries, speculation surrounded the cause. Murder was suggested, political intrigue imagined, a blow to the head, poison, assassination orchestrated by ambitious advisors. These theories flourished especially in the early 20th century, when the discovery of his tomb reignited fascination with the royal drama. Modern analysis has complicated those narratives. Early X-rays taken in the 1960s seem to reveal a fragment of bone inside the skull, leading some to suspect fatal head trauma. Later, CT scans clarified that this fragment was likely a result of the mummification process or damage during tomb excavation. There is no clear evidence of lethal injury to the skull. Attention then shifted to his leg. A fracture in his left femur appears to have occurred shortly before death. The break was severe, and there are signs that it had not yet healed. In an environment without antibiotics, a compound fracture could become infected rapidly. Sepsis, the body's overwhelming response to infection, would have been difficult to control with ancient medical knowledge. Combined with evidence of malaria infection detected in his remains, the picture becomes more complex. Malaria weakens the immune system. If he was already managing congenital conditions and skeletal issues, his body may have been vulnerable to additional stress. One plausible scenario is this. A fall or accident caused a leg fracture. Infection set in. Malaria or another illness compromised recovery. Within days or weeks, his condition deteriorated beyond rescue. Such a sequence does not require conspiracy. It requires only fragility. The palace atmosphere during his final days would have been tense and hushed. Tutankhamun likely remained close, aware that the future of the dynasty hung in balance. Advisors like and Horemheb would have monitored developments carefully. The absence of a surviving heir magnified the crisis. Priests would have intensified ritual, incense thick in chamber air, protective spells recited, amulets pressed against linen wrappings, appeals to Amun, to Isis, to Thoth, the language of healing spoken with urgency. Royal physicians applied poultices and honey to wounds, bandages were tightened, cooling compresses placed against fevered skin, yet medicine had limits. For a king, death was not merely personal, it threatened stability. Tutankhamun's reign had restored order after a period of upheaval. His name was now associated with renewal. But he had not lived long enough to secure succession through a living child. The two small mummified infants found later in his tomb suggest that attempts had been made, but no heir survived. When his breathing slowed and finally ceased, the palace would have fallen into ritual motion. Death in ancient Egypt triggered immediate preparation for the afterlife. The body needed preservation. The soul required guidance. Time, though urgent politically, followed strict religious procedure. Embalmers began the mummification process quickly. Organs were removed and placed in canopic jars guarded by protective deities. The body was dried with natron, wrapped in layers of linen, and adorned with amulets. Oils and resins were applied generously. The care taken in his burial preparation suggests reverence, but it also hints at haste. His tomb, located in the Valley of the Kings, appears smaller than those of many predecessors. Some objects placed within may have originally been intended for others. Items were reinscribed with his name. The scale suggests that his death came earlier than anticipated, before a grander tomb had been completed. The burial chamber itself was prepared with murals depicting scenes of transition to the afterlife. Osiris embraced the king. Anubis oversaw preservation. The gods welcomed him into their realm. The golden mask, now iconic, was placed over his face. Crafted with remarkable precision, it idealized his features into serene eternity. Whatever pain he may have endured in life was erased beneath smooth gold. Outside the burial chamber, political calculation accelerated. Without a son, succession was uncertain. Ankhesenamun's position became precarious. Evidence suggests she wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, requesting that one of his sons come to Egypt to marry her and assume the throne. The letter reportedly expressed desperation, stating she had no son and did not wish to marry a servant. If authentic, this letter reveals the urgency and fear that followed Tutankhamun's death. A foreign prince was eventually sent but was killed en route, under circumstances still debated. I moved quickly to secure power. He married Ankhesenamun and assumed kingship, likely presenting himself as legitimate successor through proximity and experience. His reign was brief, lasting only a few years. Horemheb, the general, would later take the throne and begin systematic erasure of the Amarna period from official memory. Thus, the sudden death of a 19-year-old king set into motion a chain of events reshaping Egypt's political future. Within the tomb, however, quiet prevailed. Tutankhamun was buried with extraordinary wealth. Chariots, jewellery, furniture, statues and ritual objects filled chambers. The nested coffins encased him in layers of protection. Guardians painted on walls watched over him. The entrance was sealed. For over 3,000 years the tomb remained largely undisturbed. While many royal burials were looted in antiquity, his lay hidden beneath debris and later construction. His name faded from common record. King lists omitted him, or passed quickly over his brief reign. The sudden death that once threatened instability eventually became the reason for his enduring fame. Had he lived a long life, his tomb might have been larger and more visible, and thus more likely plundered. Instead, his early death led to burial in a modest chamber that remained concealed. In life, his fragility may have limited him. In death, it preserved him. The image of a boy king dying at 19 carries quiet poignancy. His reign had been one of restoration, not conquest. His achievements lay in healing division rather than expanding empire. And just as stability seemed secure, his life ended. The palace that once echoed with ceremony now echoed with mourning. Ankhesenamun's future became uncertain. Advisors repositioned themselves. The machinery of state adapted swiftly as it always had. Yet beneath the desert cliffs, sealed within golden linen, Tutankhamun's body rested. The fragile bones that had carried divine title lay motionless. The walking sticks placed beside him suggested journeys ahead in the afterlife. The suddenness of his death remains part of his mystique. No dramatic battlefield, no decades-long reign culminating in age. Instead, a youth cut short, a restoration interrupted. And as the tomb door closed and sand slowly accumulated above it, the story of a 19-year-old pharaoh who had steadied a fractured kingdom slipped quietly into silence, awaiting a rediscovery that would come thousands of years later, when light would once again touch the golden mask that concealed the fragile human story beneath it, and the world would learn how abruptly a reign could end while its legend was only just beginning to form. When Tutankhamun died, the rituals of eternity had to begin immediately. In ancient Egypt, death was not a pause but a transformation. The body had to be preserved carefully. The spirit required preparation. Words had to be spoken in precise sequence, offerings arranged, protective spells positioned. Every delay risked imbalance. Yet beneath the ritual urgency lay a practical problem. The young king had not lived long enough to complete the kind of monumental tomb typically prepared for a pharaoh. Royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were often planned years in advance. corridors carved deep into limestone cliffs, chambers aligned carefully, walls decorated with complex scenes from sacred texts guiding the soul through the underworld. Construction teams worked steadily during a king's lifetime, expanding and refining the burial space as years passed. Tutankhamun had reigned for roughly a decade, and much of that time had been devoted to restoring temples and stabilizing governance. There is little evidence that he had commissioned a vast tomb on the scale of earlier rulers. When he died around 19, the infrastructure for a grand burial may not have been ready. The tomb chosen for him, today designated KV62 in the Valley of the Kings, is modest in size compared to many others nearby. Its entrance lies lower in the valley, tucked beneath debris and the remains of later construction. The corridors are short, the chambers few. The layout suggests that it may originally have been intended for a high-ranking official rather than a pharaoh. If that is the case, then Tutankhamun's burial required rapid adaptation. The embalming process itself lasted about 70 days. During that period, the body was treated with natron salts to dry it, internal organs removed and preserved, and layers of linen applied carefully. Priests recited spells. Amulets were placed between wrappings to guard against harm in the afterlife. The heart was left in place, essential for judgment before Osiris. Meanwhile, artisans and workers moved swiftly. Furniture, chariots, statues, and ritual objects were gathered and arranged. Some items appear to have been made specifically for him. Others show signs of alteration. Cartouches were reinscribed, decorative elements adjusted. It is possible that certain pieces had originally been intended for another royal burial, and were repurposed when the need arose. The nested coffin system placed around his body is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the burial. 3 coffins, each fitting within the other, culminated in the innermost solid gold coffin that cradled his mummy. That coffin alone weighs over 100 kilograms. Its surface bears intricate engraving and inlays of coloured glass and semi-precious stones. The outer shrines that enclosed the sarcophagus were enormous, filling nearly the entire burial chamber. Gilded wooden structures nested within one another like protective walls. The limited size of the chamber meant that these shrines nearly touched the walls, leaving little space for movement once installed. This density reflects urgency. There was no time to carve expansive corridors decorated with full-length funerary texts. Instead, the burial chamber walls were painted relatively quickly. The scenes are simpler than those in some larger tombs. They depict the opening of the mouth ceremony, Osiris welcoming the king, and other essential transitions into the afterlife. The style of these paintings suggests efficiency. Lines are bold. Composition is direct. The priority was completion rather than elaborate innovation. Outside the burial chamber, the antechamber overflowed with objects. Beds carved in the shape of sacred animals, thrones adorned with scenes of domestic intimacy, chests filled with clothing, bows and arrows, sandals, jewellery, cosmetic containers, games, everything necessary for comfort in eternity. The sheer volume of items placed within the tomb has often overshadowed the fact that space was limited. Objects were stacked carefully but densely. It was not the arrangement of a carefully staged, spacious royal tomb. It was the arrangement of a burial prepared swiftly yet with reverence. Even the sarcophagus itself required adjustment. Made of quartzite with a red granite lid, it may not originally have been crafted specifically for him. Some scholars suggest it was repurposed from another royal project. Its dimensions fit tightly within the chamber, leaving little margin. The mummification process appears to have been conducted thoroughly, though with some unusual aspects. The use of excessive resins darkened and hardened the wrappings. The embalmer's application of these materials was so heavy that when Howard Carter later attempted to remove the mummy from the coffin, it adhered firmly to the base and required careful separation. The golden mask placed over Tutankhamun's face was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Its serene expression, wide inlaid eyes, and Neem's headdress convey timeless authority. It idealizes youth and divinity. Beneath it lay a face that had known illness and vulnerability. The haste of preparation did not diminish quality. On the contrary, many objects placed within the tomb are among the finest examples of New Kingdom artistry. The golden shrine panels display exquisite detail. The jewellery reveals remarkable precision. The canopic shrine protecting his preserved organs stands as a testament to reverence. Haste does not always mean carelessness. It can mean intensity. Within the Valley of the Kings, the burial likely unfolded with solemn procession. The body transported from palace to valley, priests chanting, Tutankhamun perhaps present, though records do not confirm her role in the ceremony. Eye appears prominently in tomb paintings performing the opening of the mouth ritual, an act that allowed the deceased to breathe, speak and eat in the afterlife. A's presence in that scene is significant. It suggests closeness to the king at the moment of transition, and foreshadows his own assumption of the throne soon after. Once the final rituals were complete, the tomb was sealed. Workers filled the entrance with rubble. Plaster seals bearing royal insignia were applied. The intention was permanence. Yet signs within the tomb indicate that it was entered at least twice in antiquity by robbers. Some small items were removed. The tomb was resealed quickly, perhaps by officials who discovered the intrusion. The thieves appear to have been interrupted before accessing the inner burial chamber fully. After that, silence settled. Over time, debris from later construction projects and natural rockfall covered the entrance. When the tomb of Rameses VI was built nearby generations later, workers' huts were constructed directly above Tutankhamun's sealed doorway. The location became obscured beneath layers of stone and sand. This accidental concealment proved decisive. While grander tombs were located and plundered repeatedly in antiquity, KV-62 remained largely hidden. Its modest size, combined with later overbuilding, protected it from extensive looting. The haste that defined its creation contributed indirectly to its survival. Had Tutankhamun lived longer and commissioned a larger, more prominent tomb, its entrance might have been easier to find. Its treasures might have vanished centuries before modern archaeology began. Instead, the hurried burial in a relatively small chamber ensured that the majority of objects placed within remained undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. The tomb's layout reflects compressed adaptation. The antechamber crowded with objects, the burial chamber nearly filled by nested shrines, the treasury chamber holding canopic equipment and statues guarding passage, the annex containing additional supplies. Each room serves clear function. None offers excess space. In life, Tutankhamun's reign had been about restoration rather than expansion. In death, his burial mirrored that modest scale. It was complete, reverent, but not monumental. The narrative carved onto the burial chamber walls focuses on transition and acceptance into the divine realm. There is no elaborate Book of Gates sequence stretching across long corridors. Instead, essential images suffice. The boy king's body lay encased within layers of protection. Linen wrappings, amulets, coffins, shrines, sarcophagus, walls, stone, earth. Outside, the political landscape shifted rapidly. I assumed the throne, marrying Ankhesenamun to legitimize his position. His reign was short. Horemheb would follow, working diligently to erase the memory of the Amarna period from official records. In those later efforts, Tutankhamun's name would be overshadowed, folded into transitional obscurity. The tomb sealed in haste thus became both refuge and archive. Inside, gold gleamed in darkness. Outside, history continued without him. For centuries, sand accumulated. Winds reshaped the valley floor. Generations of priests and workers passed without knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. Even in antiquity, his name faded from common recitation. King lists prioritized longer and more impactful reigns. Yet beneath the limestone cliffs, the hurriedly prepared chamber remained intact. The density of objects within suggests urgency, but also devotion. Those who prepared the tomb worked with care. They ensured that even if the space was small, the king would lack nothing in eternity. Walking sticks were placed beside him, sandals ready for travel, food offerings sealed in jars, games to pass time in the afterlife, jewellery to affirm status, protective deities carved into every surface. The tomb prepared in haste became one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in modern history. But at the moment of sealing, no one could foresee that. For those present in the valley, the burial was closure. The young king was entrusted to Osiris. The door was sealed. The living returned to palace and temple. Silence followed, and as centuries layered dust and stone over the entrance, the modest tomb cut quickly into rock began its long period of concealment, waiting beneath the desert floor while dynasties rose and fell above it, and while the memory of the boy king dimmed into near invisibility, preserved only in faint inscriptions and fading stone, until the day when footsteps would once again echo down its corridor, and light would pierce the darkness that had guarded its hurried preparation for more than 3 millennia. When the final seal was pressed into wet plaster, and the entrance blocked with stone and rubble, the burial of Tutankhamun was meant to be permanent. The rituals had been performed correctly, the spells recited, the amulets placed with precision, the nested coffins enclosed the body, the shrines filled the chamber wall to wall. The tomb workers stepped back into daylight, and the valley returned to stillness. No one present could have imagined how complete that stillness would become. The Valley of the Kings was not an isolated place. It lay across the Nile from Thebes, hidden among barren cliffs, yet it was part of a working landscape. Tombs were cut there for generations. Workers' huts were built along its edges. Processions passed through its paths. Guards monitored entrances as long as royal authority could sustain vigilance. Yet time erodes vigilance. In the decades and centuries following Tutankhamun's burial, the valley continued to receive new tombs. Larger, more elaborate sepulchres were carved for rulers who followed. Rameses II, Seti I, and others commissioned grand corridors stretching deep into rock, adorned with detailed funerary texts. These tombs were impressive, but their visibility made them vulnerable. Tutankhamun's tomb, by contrast, lay modestly placed. Its entrance was not prominently positioned. It did not lead into long descending passageways that announced scale. Instead, it lay tucked lower in the valley floor. When later tombs were constructed nearby, debris from those projects was dumped without concern for what lay beneath. Over time, huts built for workers constructing the tomb of Rameses, the sixth stood directly above the entrance to KV-62. Stone chips, dust and sand accumulated. The small stairway leading down to the sealed doorway disappeared beneath layers of rockfall and debris. The tomb was not entirely untouched in antiquity. Evidence suggests that shortly after burial it was entered by thieves at least twice. Small items were removed, some containers opened. Yet the intrusion appears limited. Officials discovered the disturbance and resealed the tomb quickly. The robbers never reached the innermost coffins. The shrines remained intact. The golden mask remained in place. After those brief disturbances, silence deepened. As centuries passed, Egypt changed. The new kingdom waned. Foreign rulers governed from different capitals. The power of Thebes declined. Eventually, royal burials in the valley ceased. Priests in later periods attempted to safeguard the mummies of earlier pharaohs by relocating them to hidden caches to protect against looting. Tutankhamun's tomb was overlooked in those relocation efforts, likely because it was already concealed. His mummy remained where it had been placed. The sands shifted. Occasional floods washed debris into low points of the valley. Each season added another thin layer to the covering above his sealed door. Beyond the valley, language itself evolved and eventually was forgotten. Hieroglyphs, once read fluently by scribes, became indecipherable. Temples fell into ruin. Columns collapsed. Statues were toppled. The names of pharaohs faded from spoken memory. King lists compiled by later rulers omitted certain names deliberately. The Amarna period, including Akhenaten, was viewed as aberration. Tutankhamun's name was not always prominently preserved. His short reign and transitional status contributed to obscurity. For nearly 3,000 years, the young king rested undisturbed. Empires rose and fell above him. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, under Alexander the Great, Romans, and later Islamic dynasties governed Egypt in succession. Each left architectural and cultural marks upon the land. None knew that beneath the valley floor, one of the most complete royal burials in history remained intact. The valley itself did not remain entirely forgotten. Travellers and explorers in the 18th and 19th centuries began to visit and document its tombs. European fascination with ancient Egypt intensified. Scholars copied inscriptions. Treasure hunters searched for undiscovered chambers. Yet the location of Tutankhamun's tomb remained concealed. Its modest scale contributed to its invisibility. Larger tombs were easier to identify and excavate. KKV 62's entrance lay beneath accumulated rubble and remnants of later construction. Without clear markers, it blended into the valley floor. The silence within the tomb was total. Inside, air remained trapped. The nested shrines stood pressed against painted walls. Furniture, chariots, statues, and jewellery lay exactly as they had been arranged. Linen wrappings hardened with resin encased the young king's body. The golden mask rested against his face in darkness. No light entered, no sound disturbed. Time did not erode the gold. The dry climate preserved organic materials remarkably well. Wood, textiles, and leather survived in ways rarely possible elsewhere. The valley's aridity became guardian. Above ground, dynasties ended and began. Christianity spread across Egypt. Later, Islam reshaped the cultural landscape. Languages shifted from hieroglyphic to Demotic to Coptic to Arabic. Tutankhamun's name passed unspoken through generations. The valley itself became subject of legend and occasional plunder. Yet even determined excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries failed to locate his burial. Several archaeologists believed the valley had yielded all its secrets. One of them, Theodore Davis, who worked extensively in the early 1900s, declared that the valley was exhausted. Nothing significant remained to be found. He was wrong. The modesty of Tutankhamun's tomb, the debris covering its entrance, and the huts of later workers combined to create perfect concealment. What had been a hurried burial became a hidden archive. The silence within the tomb preserved more than treasure. It preserved a moment in Egyptian history frozen at the end of the 18th dynasty. The objects placed within reflect a kingdom in restoration. They carry traces of Amarna's artistic influence alongside traditional motifs. They preserve furniture used in palace life, clothing folded carefully, weapons and ceremonial items untouched. 3,000 years of silence shielded these artifacts from melting down, reuse, or destruction. Elsewhere in the valley, looters stripped tombs bare within decades of burial. Gold was removed, coffins dismantled, mummies desecrated. Tutankhamun's modest chamber escaped that fate largely by accident. The valley's cliffs remained unchanged in shape, though weathered by time. Winds carved fine patterns into rock. Occasional flash floods reshaped pathways. Yet beneath accumulated sediment, the sealed doorway remained intact. In the early 20th century, renewed systematic excavation began under British archaeologist Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon. Carter believed that at least one royal tomb remained undiscovered. He focused on areas overlooked by previous teams, including the floor near the tomb of Ramesses VI. By 1922, after years of work yielding little, funding grew uncertain. Carter persisted. In November of that year, workers clearing debris uncovered the top of a staircase cut into rock. Step by step they revealed the sealed doorway at its base. But before that moment of rediscovery, before candlelight flickered inside for the first time in millennia, the tomb existed only as silence. 3,000 years of stillness preserved a young king whose reign had once seemed minor. The absence of disturbance became the foundation of his modern fame. Forgotten in the valley, Tutankhamun lay in darkness, while the world above transformed beyond recognition. Empires collapsed, languages shifted, religions rose. Scholars puzzled over fragments of Egyptian history without suspecting that one of its most complete stories rested intact beneath their feet. The silence was not empty, it was protective. And as the desert sun rose and set countless times over the valley cliffs, the sealed chamber remained unchanged within, holding gold, linen, and fragile bone in unbroken darkness, waiting for a moment when human curiosity would once again descend those steps and disturb the quiet that had guarded the boy king for longer than any ruler of his era could have imagined. In November of 1922, the Valley of the Kings no longer belonged to pharaohs. It belonged to archaeologists, labourers, tourists, and governments, negotiating control over Egypt's ancient past. Tomb entrances had been mapped, corridors measured, walls copied. Many believed the valley had yielded its final secrets. Theodore Davis, who had excavated extensively in the area, had declared it exhausted. Howard Carter disagreed. Carter had spent years working methodically in the valley under the financial backing of George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Season after season, his team cleared debris in areas that others had overlooked. Progress was slow, funding grew strained. By 1922, Carnarvon's patience had nearly run out. Carter asked for one final season. On November 4th, 1922, a water boy working near the base of the tomb of Ramesses VI stumbled upon the top of a cut stone step buried beneath rubble. Carter recognized its significance immediately. The step did not belong to Ramesses VI's tomb. It was aligned differently, descending at a sharper angle. Workers cleared more debris. 12 steps emerged, leading downward to a sealed doorway stamped with necropolis seals bearing the jackal and 9 captive symbol of royal burial grounds. Carter's pulse must have quickened. The name on the seals was partially obscured, but enough remained to identify the cartouche of Tutankhamun. The boy king, largely forgotten in popular memory, had left a mark in plaster. Carter halted excavation and sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. At last I've made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Carnarvon arrived weeks later. On November 26th, Carter made a small breach in the upper left corner of the sealed doorway. He inserted a candle and peered through. The famous exchange followed. Carnarvon asked if he could see anything. Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." What he saw was not yet the burial chamber itself. It was the antechamber, filled chaotically yet magnificently with objects. Gilded couches shaped like sacred animals, disassembled chariots, carved boxes, stacked furniture. Everywhere, gold gleamed in the candlelight. The air inside had been sealed for more than 3,000 years. When Carter opened the breach, the scent of ancient resins and linen drifted outward. Dust particles swirled in narrow beams of light. The doorway bore signs of ancient intrusion and resealing. Robbers had entered briefly long ago, but the tomb had been secured again. Unlike other royal burials stripped bare, this chamber remained densely filled. Carter widened the opening carefully and entered. The sight defied expectation. Objects were not arranged in orderly display. They were crowded together, layered in haste. Yet their craftsmanship was extraordinary. Chairs with lion-headed arms, shrines gilded with intricate detail, weapons and walking sticks bundled together. The discovery stunned the archaeological world. In February 1923, after months of careful cataloguing and removal of objects from the antechamber, Carter located a second sealed doorway leading into the burial chamber. This door also bore intact seals. When opened, it revealed 4 massive gilded shrines occupying nearly the entire space. These nested structures enclosed the stone sarcophagus at the centre. The room's walls were painted with scenes of transition into the afterlife. Unlike the densely packed antechamber, the burial chamber conveyed solemn order. Removing the shrines required months of meticulous work. Each panel was documented and dismantled carefully. When the sarcophagus lid was finally lifted, 3 coffins were revealed, one within another. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, contained the mummy. In October 1925, Carter and his team lifted the final lid. There, wrapped in linen and covered with amulets, lay Tutankhamun. The golden mask covered his face. Its expression was serene, youthful, composed. Inlaid eyes of quartz and obsidian seemed almost alive in the lamplight, gold in the darkness. The scale of preservation was unprecedented. Most royal tombs in the valley had been looted extensively in antiquity. Precious metals melted down, jewellery stolen, mummies damaged. Here, nearly everything remained. The discovery captivated global attention. Newspapers around the world reported on each development. Photographs by Harry Burton documented the excavation meticulously. The image of Carter peering into the tomb became iconic. Egyptology entered popular imagination in a way it never had before. The discovery also generated controversy. Egypt in the early 20th century was navigating complex political realities under British influence. Questions of ownership, removal of artifacts, and national heritage emerged quickly. Ultimately, the entire contents of the tomb remained in Egypt, a decision that preserved them within the country. Rumours of a curse spread following Carnarvon's death in April 1923 from blood poisoning after a mosquito bite became infected. Newspapers amplified the story, claiming mysterious forces protected the tomb. In reality, many members of the excavation team lived long lives, yet the narrative of curse added to public fascination. Within the tomb itself, the condition of the mummy revealed challenges. Excess resin applied during embalming had hardened, causing the body to adhere to the coffin. Carter's team carefully separated the wrappings, documenting amulets and jewellery placed within. The golden mask, weighing over 10 kilograms, became the defining image of ancient Egypt in modern consciousness. Its smooth features conveyed eternal youth. The delicate craftsmanship reflected remarkable skill. Beyond the mask, thousands of objects were catalogued. Clothing folded carefully, sandals sized for the king's feet, food offerings sealed in jars, musical instruments, board games, cosmetic equipment. The intimacy of these items transformed Tutankhamun from distant ruler into human presence. The discovery reshaped understanding of the new kingdom. Because so many tombs had been looted, scholars previously relied on fragmentary evidence. KV-62 provided a nearly intact snapshot of royal burial practice. The layering of coffins, the arrangement of shrines, the selection of grave goods, all offered unparalleled insight. Tutankhamun's reign, once considered minor, became central to public fascination. The irony is clear. His brief life and modest tomb placement, combined with later concealment, preserved his burial. That preservation made him the most famous pharaoh in modern history. The valley that had held silence for 3 millennia now buzzed with activity. Visitors lined paths. Journalists crowded near entrances. The quiet desert became stage for global attention. Yet inside the burial chamber, amid electric lights and cameras, the ancient atmosphere lingered. The walls still bore paint applied in haste. The stone sarcophagus still occupied its central position. The mask still rested over features that had once smiled, perhaps struggled, perhaps endured pain. Gold reflected light once again. The discovery did not change Tutankhamun's life. It changed his afterlife. He had been buried swiftly in a small chamber, forgotten by later king lists, overshadowed by successors who sought to erase the Amarna period, and then, through patient excavation and a fortunate decision to dig beneath debris others ignored, his name returned to prominence. The image of gold in darkness became emblem of Egypt itself. And as Carter stood within that chamber, recording each object carefully before removal, he bridged a span of 30 centuries in a single glance, illuminating not only treasure, but the fragile story of a young king whose reign had been brief, yet whose burial had waited patiently in silence for the moment when modern eyes would once again meet the serene gaze of a golden mask that had endured the weight of history without disturbance, until that narrow beam of candlelight first pierced the sealed doorway and revealed wonders that had not been seen since the day the tomb was closed. When we think of Tutankhamun now, we do not usually picture the palace corridors, the temple restorations, or the careful negotiations that shaped his brief reign. We picture a face, gold, smooth, calm, eyes outlined in dark stone, a gaze that feels steady and distant at the same time. That image has travelled further than the young king ever could in life. Tutankhamun ruled for only about 10 years. He did not conquer vast territories. He did not leave behind towering monuments that redefined Egypt's skyline. His tomb was not the largest in the valley. His reign, in the long sweep of Egyptian history, might have remained a footnote. Yet he endures more vividly than many rulers who achieved far more by conventional standards. There is something quiet about that endurance. Part of it is accident. His tomb, prepared in haste and cut modestly into the rock, was concealed by debris and later construction. While grander burials were plundered repeatedly over centuries, his remained largely intact. When Howard Carter opened the sealed doorway in 1922, he stepped into a chamber that preserved not only gold, but context. Furniture stood where it had been placed. Chariots leaned against walls. Linen still wrapped the king's fragile body. The preservation of that context allowed the modern world to encounter Tutankhamun not as a broken fragment, but as a nearly complete moment in time. We saw how a pharaoh was buried. We saw what objects accompanied him. We saw the scale of care invested in his passage to the afterlife. And through those objects we began to see the person. The walking sticks, worn at the tips, suggested movement that required support. The small sandals, carefully crafted, reminded us of his youth. The intimate scene on the golden throne, where Tutankhamun stands close to him, conveyed tenderness rarely emphasized in older royal art. These details softened the image of distant divinity. Tutankhamun was born into upheaval. He inherited a kingdom divided by religious reform. Under guidance, he restored traditional worship and returned the capital to Thebes. He embodied correction without overt condemnation. He stood at the hinge between radical experiment and renewed continuity. And then, at 19, he died. His life did not unfold into long maturity. There were no decades to reshape his reputation through grand campaigns or monumental building. What he left behind was stabilization and restoration. In many ways, he was caretaker rather than conqueror. Perhaps that is part of why his story resonates. He represents fragility within power, a king who may have walked with difficulty, a ruler who relied on advisors, a young man who lost children before they could live, a sovereign who carried divine title in a body marked by vulnerability. The golden mask conceals those details, yet knowledge of them does not diminish its impact, it deepens it. The mask itself is not expressionless. The lips curve gently. The eyes are wide, alert. The eyebrows arched with precision. It presents eternal composure. It does not show pain. It does not show uncertainty. It offers a steady horizon. That horizon connects back to his earliest years. He was born in a city named Akhenaten, horizon of the Atene. His childhood unfolded beneath open sunlight in a desert capital, dedicated to a singular vision. Later, he returned to Thebes and embraced the layered pantheon of older gods. His life bridged horizons, literal and symbolic. Now, when visitors stand before his mask in a museum, they often fall silent. There is a stillness to the encounter. The gold reflects light softly. The inlaid stones hold depth. The face, though idealized, suggests youth suspended in time. Tutankhamun still watches the horizon because his story sits at the edge of change. He lived at a moment when Egypt questioned itself, when religious identity shifted dramatically, when political structures required careful recalibration. His reign did not seek to erase the past violently. It sought to restore balance. In a world that often celebrates dramatic conquest and bold revolution, there is something quietly compelling about restoration. He reminds us that not all significance lies in expansion. Sometimes it lies in repair. The 3,000 years of silence that followed his burial preserved that reminder. While other rulers' tombs were emptied and scattered, his remained sealed. His modest resting place became vault and time capsule. When opened, it offered the modern world not only treasure, but connection. Connection to a teenager who carried expectations far larger than his years. Connection to a society that believed in continuity beyond death. Connection to artisans whose craftsmanship transcended centuries. His name, once nearly omitted from official king lists, is now among the most widely recognised in history. There is irony in that. The boy king who might have faded entirely from memory became emblem of ancient Egypt itself. School children learn his name before they learn of Rameses II or Thutmose III. The Golden Mask appears in textbooks, documentaries, and exhibitions worldwide. Yet behind the spectacle of gold lies a quieter narrative, a young ruler born into upheaval, a measured restoration, a fragile body, a sudden death, a hurried tomb, long concealment, sudden rediscovery. The horizon he watches now is not the Nile's eastern bank or the desert cliffs of Thebes. It is the horizon of memory. Every generation that looks upon his image adds another layer to that memory. Scholars continue to analyse his remains. Curators preserve his artefacts carefully. Visitors move slowly past display cases, drawn to the calm expression of a face shaped more than 3 millennia ago. He still watches because we still look, and perhaps that is the final quiet truth of his story. Tutankhamun did not choose the moment of his birth. He did not choose the upheaval he inherited. He did not choose the fragility of his body or the brevity of his life. Yet through accident and preservation, he became a witness across time. The horizon before him stretches not across desert, but across centuries. His golden face remains composed, neither triumphant nor sorrowful. It does not demand attention, it receives it. And as the lights dim in museums at closing time, and the halls grow quiet again, the boy king rests beneath layers of protection once more, his gaze steady, his story carried forward not by conquest or empire, but by the simple endurance of a life, brief yet luminous enough to bridge the distance between ancient stone and the present moment, where he continues, silently, to watch the horizon while the world moves gently on.